Chapter 568. Go to the side and die. Everyone knew that it would be a dead end if they couldn't deal with these three monsters. All of their efforts would be for naught. Screech! The Silver Eagle King issued a loud eagle cry, and finally moved into action at this time. His wings fluttered, and unleashed endless winds. Consequently, a huge tornado swept towards that Buddhist monk zombie, who hadn't acted so far. The Buddhist monk zombie roared, and summoned a Buddha. A grayish Buddha aura suddenly illuminated the world, and an image of Buddha appeared behind the Buddhist monk zombie. However, this Buddha had fiendish features. It was a corpse Buddha. The corpse Buddha opened his eyes, and it seemed as if the world had sunk into darkness within an instant. Everything seemed to have sunk into the world of zombies. Endless grayish light swept out, and went up towards that tornado in order to tackle it. Rumble! Two dreadful forces suddenly collided in the space. This dreadful collision made the space around the point of collision ripple, like the surface of boiling water. The space boiled and frantically distorted. Then, the ripples swept across one after another. The forces of both sides had been routed in midair. Then the Silver Eagle King moved once again. Silver rays of light burst out from its body in the form of a ring, and condensed into a huge falcon in the void. The huge falcon cried loudly, and rushed towards the Buddhist monk. Roar! The Buddha that was behind that Buddhist monk zombie roared loudly. He opened his mouth like a sacrificial bowl, and stretched out a big black claw towards that huge falcon in order to grab it. Bang! This was a terrifying scene. The big black claw penetrated that huge silver falcon, and ripped it apart. Then another big hand stretched out, but disappeared a second later. It seemed as if the hand had penetrated into the space, but it reappeared a moment later. However, it was already in front of the Silver Eagle King this time. Screech! The Silver Eagle King screamed as its wings got torn apart by that big hand. Blood splashed out from his body as a result. The big hand retracted whilst holding the wings. Then the corpse Buddha opened his mouth like a sacrificial bowl, and gobbled up those wings. Everyone trembled with fear as they heard the crunch sound of bones being chewed and crushed by the corpse Buddha. One must know that the Silver Eagle King had cultivated to the pinnacle of sage accomplished realm. It could be even said that his bones were as hard as steel. However, they had been chewed and crushed by the corpse Buddha with ease. Holy crap! What kind of fucking monster is this? The Zhuyan ape couldn't take it anymore. It turned around and escaped. It had no reason to stake its life in a fight with these three monsters. It had already seen the Silver Eagle King fighting with them. Its wings had been torn apart and eaten by the corpse Buddha, even though it was in the form of Silver Eagle King. The Zhuyan ape didn't want to see its own limbs torn apart, and devoured as well. That would be extremely terrifying. Everyone lost their courage when they saw the Silver Eagle King's wings being shattered by the Buddhist monk zombie. The Zhuyan ape had already escaped. Nobody wanted to step forward and throw away their life. Therefore, they flew away in the direction of the gate one after another. The entire troop had gotten dispersed. All of them had rushed towards the exit one after another. Yi Shiwen quickly rushed towards the two women at a rapid speed and said, "Follow me closely, we're leaving." He didn't want to stay here and fight these three monsters either. These three monsters hadn't entered the half-step of Great Sage Realm yet. However, their strength was still unfathomable. It might be possible that they had been suppressed by the rules of Great Gas Collar. Or they had just woken from an eternal sleep, and this was their weakest time. Yi Shiwen possessed the fighting prowess of a Heaven's Pride expert. Still, he couldn't dare to say that he could defeat them within a short time. Moreover, they would become even more ferocious once they gradually recovered. So, wasn't staying here equivalent to courting death? Boy, hand over my sacred spring of life. Everyone tried to escape at the same time, and thus created a chaotic situation. However, the speed of those three outrageously powerful zombies was much faster than theirs. Therefore, they had to run faster than the other experts to prevent the wrath of those three monsters from falling upon them. A lot of people were thinking this, and Yi Shiwen was no exception. Therefore, the person that was looking for him at such a time could only be Tang Can. After all, he was originally the most promising contender for obtaining the sacred spring of life. This represented the so-called saying the mantis stalks the cicada unaware of the oriole behind it. Tang Ken was initially the cicada, and Yi Shiwen became the oriole in the end. Therefore, Tang Ken was in a very foul mood when he saw Yi Shiwen. At this time he rushed towards Yi Shiwen and blocked his way by arriving in front of him. "Step aside or die," Yi Shiwen shouted loudly. His hands clenched into fists and blasted away Tang Ken's divine beam. It was followed by a slap. Bang! A loud sound of breaking of bones was heard as expected. It was crisp and brutal. However, the result was contrary to everyone's expectations, since it wasn't Yi Shiwen who had suffered a loss. Instead, Tang Ken had suffered a huge defeat. He had been slapped on his head by Yi Shiwen and had gone out flying as a result. Tang Ken had attacked moments ago, but he had already been defeated by Yi Shiwen in an effortless manner. His strength was apparently not as good as that of Gong Yanjia. Gong Yanjia's demeanor was arrogant and domineering. However, he was at the top when it came to strength. He was a true powerhouse of the sage accomplished realm. He was second only to the Heaven's Pride experts in terms of fighting prowess. This was why he had the confidence to behave in an arrogant and despotic manner. However, Yi Shiwen had quickly realized that Tang Ken was far weaker than Gong Yanjia. Therefore, there was no comparison between him and a person like Yi Shiwen who stood bravely over a mountain of corpses and ocean of blood. They just weren't on the same level. Moreover, Yi Shiwen was in a moment of desperation right now. So he didn't hold back even a bit, and attacked with his entire strength. The two individuals' attacks set off an incomparably dreadful storm. It swept out layer upon layer of energy just like sea waves. Tang Ken screamed, and suddenly spouted a mouthful of blood. His body went out flying upside down the next moment. It wasn't clear how many of his bones had been fractured as a result. He landed at the edge of the fleeing troop, and was immediately grabbed and torn apart by the Taoist priest zombie. He screamed endlessly as his body got torn into two halves. Then his body was devoured. Nobody was in a mood to sympathize with this powerful person that used to be in the limelight. However, their opinion about Yi Shiwen had immediately changed. He had become an exceptionally fierce person in their eyes since he had slaughtered two sage accomplished level experts in succession. They had started taking him to be as ferocious as those three zombies that were pursuing them. A lot of people had been eyeing the sacred spring of life that was in his hands. However, this thought cooled down when they saw this scene. After all, they had realized that their small tricks wouldn't work on him. Yi Shiwen could feel that the auras of those three zombies were becoming increasingly formidable. As if someone had just awakened from a deep sleep. Getting increasingly scary. Yi Shiwen, I'm afraid an extraordinary person may be buried inside this tomb. And perhaps, these three zombies were there to guard the inner chamber of this tomb. You people have woken up these three monsters by bursting into the tomb. Yemo said. I can feel that some extraordinary being is lying therein. So it would be better if you quickly left this place. The faster the better, the farther you go the better it is. Yi Shiwen nodded. He also didn't want to stay here. Yi Ziwen's speed was extremely fast. His speed had maintained at the peak even though he was carrying two individuals. He overtook the majority of people, and reached near the gate in an instant. Like a golden flash. However, he suddenly found out that the terrifying auras of those three monsters had firmly locked upon his body. They were pursuing him tightly, and were getting closer. It was evident that they didn't wish to let him go. Those three zombies were like three heavy tanks. The experts in their way either got torn apart or went out flying. It was hard to tell whether these experts were dead or alive after being run over. The three zombies had been happily slaughtering these experts. However, they had suddenly started to ignore these experts and had made Yi Shiwen their primary target. Yi Ziwen's devil wings were an incredible magical technique, and his agility skill was extremely quick. It wasn't clear how much distance he had traveled in an instant, just like a lightning flash. However, these three zombies had also been extremely ferocious individuals when they were alive. Therefore, each of them had excellent agility skill of their own. They also overtook the majority of experts in an instant. You had it coming. This guy has dared to rob the sacred spring of life. He deserves to be chased to the end of the world. The Zhuyan ape wasn't very far. It had noticed that the target of these three zombies was Yi Shiwen now. Therefore, it started to take pleasure in Yi Ziwen's misfortune. The fact that it couldn't obtain the sacred spring of life was eating him inside. However, it was no longer depressed because of this fact. On the contrary, it felt glad because those 3 zombies would have been chasing it instead of Yi Shiwen if it had taken away the sacred spring of life. And it reckoned that they would have caught him by now since its agility skill wasn't good enough. In fact, it would have been dead by now. Soon, the other experts also felt glad as they also found out that these 3 zombies were chasing Yi Shiwen. They promptly got out of the way so that they didn't get injured. Those 3 zombies didn't have any interest in them for the time being. Everyone got ignored apart from a few unlucky ones that came in the way of those zombies. These experts were suddenly feeling glad that they hadn't snatched the sacred spring of life. Otherwise, they would have died without a doubt. Yi Shiwen felt that those zombies were getting increasingly close to him. Moreover, their auras became increasingly powerful as they approached him. 3 ice-cold and formidable auras had firmly locked upon him. It was needless to say that it seemed that they wouldn't give up until they dismembered his body into 10,000 pieces. They roared again and again, and their ominous energy soared everywhere. The devil wings were a top-tier agility technique. However, Yi Shiwen was merely at the peak of Sage Realm. Those 3 monsters that were behind him had been suppressed by the rules of the Great Gas Collar. Otherwise, it wasn't clear what grade of monsters they were. In addition, their agility techniques were no joke. They were catching up little by little. This is bad. We will get caught sooner or later if things go on like this. Yi Shiwen fully unleashed his devil wings. Wind and thunder loudly swept out from them. And endless wind and thunder power surged towards those zombies that were behind him. He didn't wish to give up the sacred spring of life. However, he didn't wish to get caught either. Therefore, he could only use such distractions to increase the distance between him and the zombies, and buy some time for himself. The speed of the 3 zombies was extremely high. They had approached the tomb's exit in the blink of an eye. There was a whole wide world outside as long as Yi Shiwen managed to get out. However, could the worst come to the worst? Could they chase him even if he escaped from the Great Gas Collar? Chapter 569. It seemed that those 3 zombies had also thought about this thing. Therefore, they roared furiously, and all kinds of corpse power techniques swept towards Yi Shiwen. Bang! 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 3 dreadful attacks got stopped by the heavenly source mirror. But the huge explosions had opened a hole in the protective barrier of the heavenly source mirror, and a part of the attack swept in through the gap. However, could it pose any threat to a person like Yi Shiwen? Yi Shiwen barged out of the tomb's main exit in a flash. He then turned around, and he saw that those 3 zombies were just roaring angrily near the exit. However, they didn't dare to step out of the tomb. Apparently, they were afraid of something. Yi Shiwen finally heaved a sigh of relief. These zombies were extremely scary. They wouldn't have allowed him to leave the Great Gas Collar if they hadn't been trapped inside the tomb. Perhaps they would have eventually caught up with him, and Yi Shiwen couldn't have avoided facing them at that time. The 2 women finally breathed a sigh of relief after getting rid of these terrifying monsters. They had cultivated to the Sage Great Perfection realm, so they could be also considered as experienced and knowledgeable individuals. However, these 3 zombies were the most terrifying creatures that they had come across in their entire lifetimes. Therefore, they were 100% sure that they wouldn't have been able to come out alive if it hadn't been for Yi Shiwen. Other people were left dumbstruck since only these 3 individuals had managed to escape. Everyone had thought that they would be able to escape since these 3 zombies had begun to chase Yi Shiwen. However, Yi Shiwen had managed to escape, and these 3 zombies had been stopped at the gate of the tomb. This had made them so depressed that they wanted to die. They had initially been taking joy in Yi Shiwen's hardship. However, they had become extremely depressed now, so much so that they felt as if they were going crazy. That giant ape had been gloating the most at first. However, he had now been entrapped inside the tomb by the 3 zombies. Yi Shiwen and those 3 zombies were extremely fast. However, the other experts weren't much slower. They didn't get enough time to stop their forward momentum, and consequently bumped into the zombies. This led to another bloody massacre. There had been a narrow gap in the 3-echelon formation that was laid out by those 3 zombies. And those experts that had wanted to escape thought that they could manage an escape from that gap. However, it was as difficult as ascending to the heaven. Clang! A sky-shaking sword light suddenly camouflaged the horizon entirely. Boundless sword beams dazzled everyone, and energy surged about. Then, a white figure rushed out of the tomb like a streamer of light. It was that white-clothed youth. He possessed an extremely outstanding sword technique. Countless sword lights had burst out from his body, and he had forcibly escaped from the hands of those three dreadful zombies. Yi Shiwen frowned. He hadn't been able to see through the cultivation of this white-clothed young man this entire time. His cultivation was extremely strong, and some of his attacks looked beyond the capacity of an average sage accomplished level expert. Yi Shiwen, this man might have lowered his cultivation in order to enter the Great Gas Collar, Yi Mo said. His real cultivation is likely at the half-step Great Sage realm. Yi Shiwen understood Yi Mo's words clearly. It had happened once that a Great Sage expert with suppressed cultivation was besieged and killed by people. However, that didn't mean that such a thing wouldn't occur again. Especially if there were enough benefits on the line. The sacred spring of life and a seat in the top inheritances of the Great Gas Building were examples of such benefits. These things were attractive even for the Great Sage experts. Therefore, it wasn't impossible that a Great Sage would suppress their cultivation and come in. Unexpectedly, that Juyan ape was the next one to attempt exiting the room after this man. It transformed into flames and rushed out while cursing. The Taoist priest zombie behind him repeatedly slashed the sword that he was holding in his hand and unleashed layer upon layer of Tao-based attacks. It seemed that he would cleave the Juyan ape into two halves. The Juyan ape didn't dare to stay there. He quickly escaped. However, the Silver Eagle King which was behind him wasn't so lucky. It got devoured by the Buddhist monk zombie. Its entire body was chewed into several pieces and was then swallowed by the zombie. It was a terrifying and gory scene. Not even 2 out of 10 experts that had gone inside for the treasure hunt managed to come out alive. This news had shaken the entire Great Gas Collar. Not all experts knew about the sacred spring of life at first. In fact, a considerable number of experts didn't know that a thing like sacred spring of life even existed. Moreover, the majority of experts that knew about it had consciously kept this place a secret. After all, nobody wanted more people to arrive here and compete with them. However, they spoke out about this matter one after another without any hesitation after it had ended with the sacred spring of life falling into Yi Ziwen's hands. In addition, some sinister people had fanned the flames behind the scenes. As a result, many experts were looking for Yi Shiwen at this time. Almost all the experts that had arrived in the Great Gas Collar were sage experts, and who among them wouldn't want to advance a step ahead in the future and enter the Great Sage realm? After all, the strength of a person would advance by leaps and bounds after they entered the Great Sage realm. Also, their lifespan would increase by double. Most importantly, their status would be entirely changed after they entered the Great Sage realm. They would become an absolute existence in the universe. Suddenly, everyone in the Great Gas Collar was discussing about that lump of sacred spring of life. And also about Yi Shiwen. Gee, that boy is very lucky. That lucky bastard has obtained the sacred spring of life. Lucky bastard? I see it as misfortune. It's hard to say how many people have issued statements and asked him to obediently surrender the sacred spring of life. Otherwise, they would kill him. Kill him? Humph humph. I'm afraid it's not that easy. A small team of experts had found that guy day before yesterday. There was even a sage accomplished level expert in that group. However, only one of them survived in the end, and that person had to escape in a distress situation. In fact, this man also wouldn't have survived if that Yi Shiwen hadn't left him alive as a warning for others. This guy is a cruel and merciless lord. This matter had become sensational. However, it started to cool down with the passage of time. Undoubtedly, many people were eyeing the sacred spring of life. However, the majority of people hadn't come to the Great Gas Collar to obtain it. The majority of people had arrived for the Great Gas Building. Half-year had passed, and the Great Gas Building was on the verge of opening. The majority of people had arrived to obtain the top 10 seats in the Great Gas Building. Everyone had begun to move closer towards the Great Gas Building since it was about to open. Many streamers of light could be seen sweeping across the sky at this time. The Great Gas Building was an extremely tall building that had stretched beyond the clouds. However, it looked simple and unadorned from afar. The atmosphere inside the Great Gas Collar was exuding endless divine beams and purple mist at the moment. This place was the center of the entire Great Gas Collar. Demon beasts and human experts had arrived in abundance here. 3 figures arrived from the distance while treading on rainbow lights. It turned out to be a man with 2 women on either side of him. The man was dressed up in cyan clothes. He possessed handsome facial features. Those 2 beautiful women had surrounded him from either side. This was the team of Yi Shiwen, Ding Tong, and Xiao Yuan Yuan. Half year has passed, and it's finally going to open now. Yi Shiwen looked afar at the Great Gas Building. He was deeply moved by the sight. He had used the majority of the last half year's time for consolidating his Sage Peak realm and firmly establishing his foundation. He had always used a stable low-level realm for handling high-level fighting prowess. This had compelled him to lay a solid foundation. His foundation had become polished and exceptionally solid after half year's tempering. Now there was no risk of falling back. His cultivation had also fully reached the peak of Sage Realm after tempering for last half year. He was just 1 step away from entering the Sage Small Perfection realm. This had given him the confidence to arrive here and compete for a seat of Great Gas Building. Yi Shiwen and Yi Mo had together analyzed the matter of the Great Gas Building. The individuals with strength above Sage Realm weren't allowed to enter the Great Gas Collar. However, it wasn't necessary that only people with Sage Realm strength could enter this place. The experts of Half-Step Great Sage Realm, or Great Sage Realm, could also enter as long as they suppressed their cultivation. The Great Sages had an image of being proud and complacent individuals. However, they were afraid that they might get besieged by people like that one time earlier. However, it wasn't impossible either. These Great Sages were on the same level as Sage Accomplished level experts after suppression. However, they were still far more powerful than ordinary Sage Accomplished level experts in terms of martial power and skill of strength utilization. Therefore, these experts were the most troublesome ones. Many ice-cold gazes swept over Yi Shiwen as soon as he arrived. These people obviously weren't welcoming to a new person's arrival since it might decrease their chances of obtaining a seat. There were only 10 seats in the Great Gas Building. So it was already a very insignificant number in the sense wherein so many experts had gathered. A person himself had a meager opportunity. A few people had the confidence that they could kill the others and make a way out. However, the majority of people were planning to take advantage of the chaos and cut a bloody path out of the battlefield in order to obtain 1 seat. Yi Shiwen was calm, and his complexion was normal while facing these gazes. However, Ding Tong and Xiao Yuan Yuan weren't at ease like him. They had followed Yi Shiwen on many expeditions in the last half year, and they had also consolidated their strength of Sage Great Perfection realm. In fact, they could enter the Sage Accomplished realm at any time. Therefore, their strength couldn't be considered as weak. However, many of these gazes belonged to Sage Accomplished level experts. There hadn't been many experts of Sage Accomplished realm initially. However, the news of the opening of Great Gas Collar had attracted many top players of Sage Realm from the nearby star fields. Consequently, there were so many experts assembled here that it seemed like a sea of experts. Yi Shiwen saw Sage Accomplished level experts wherever he looked. Some of them were strong, while some were weak. However, almost everyone's aura was terrifying. These auras were much more terrifying than that of those Sage Accomplished level experts that he had seen inside the tomb. This was because only a small number of people knew that there was a sacred spring of life present in that tomb. It wasn't like this place. Every expert's focus was fixed on this venue. Yi Shiwen, these people don't seem like the friendly bunch. Yi Mo clicked his tongue and said, "It seems that obtaining a seat is impossible if attempted peacefully. I wasn't planning to obtain a seat in a peaceful manner in the first place. I must seize a place, and I don't care if I have to cause a bloodbath to do so." Yi Shiwen narrowed his eyes and replied. This matter was doomed to be messy. A lot of visions that contained killing intentions for the green-scaled fruit swept out in the surroundings. You're that Yi Shiwen, aren't you? Hand over the sacred spring of life, and I'll spare your life. You don't deserve to keep it. An ice-cold voice suddenly sounded from afar. Chapter 570. You're that Yi Shiwen, aren't you? Hand over the sacred spring of life, and it'll spare your life. You don't deserve to keep it. A big guy with a red beard came from afar while treading the rainbow light. The boundless aura he brought along with him was surging about. He looked extremely ferocious. He was a senior expert of sage accomplished realm. His face was brimming with confidence at the moment. He coveted the sacred spring of life that was in Yi Ziwen's possession. After all, this treasure could help him in making the breakthrough into the great sage realm. Therefore, it was the most important thing for him. The look in the eyes of this big guy with red beard appeared ice cold. He looked aloof and detached from worldly affairs. Moreover, the manner in which he had spoken had made it seem as if he was giving an order. Yi Shiwen was a nobody of sage realm peak in his eyes. He was merely an ordinary person. Merely an ant. And he had still dared to appear here. Wasn't this a golden opportunity bestowed upon that expert by the heavens? Other people hadn't paid attention to Yi Shiwen yet. Otherwise, they would have confronted Yi Shiwen, and then snatched the sacred spring of life from him. After all, the sacred spring of life was like a ticket that could take a person directly to the great sage realm. Therefore, this big guy definitely wouldn't give up. What? He is Yi Shiwen? This boy is very audacious. He has dared to come to this place. I would have found some safe place in the great gas collar, and undergone closed-door training for several hundred years if I were him. After all, things become entirely different after one has made the breakthrough into the great sage realm. This guy has always been extremely audacious. He has obtained the sacred spring of life, but he still isn't satisfied. Now he is coveting one of the 10 seats. He is asking for it. God knows how many people are eyeing his sacred spring of life covetously. And now, he has been confronted by an evil guy like Ran Hongbin. Many people knew about Yi Shiwen, so they casted their sharp gazes on him after his identity got exposed by that big expert with red beard. The allure of the sacred spring of life was very strong, and these people had great self-confidence. They were ambitious and vigorous. They believed that Yi Shiwen was like a child who had arrived in a bustling street with a piece of gold in his hands. He was simply asking to be robbed. Many eyes among them contained a look of disdain. What was a trivial person of sage realm peak in front of them? They didn't believe the rumor that a sage accomplished level expert had lost at Yi Ziwen's hands. In fact, this absurd rumor was laughable to them. Fuck off. Yi Shiwen spoke only these 2 words in the face of the threatening and imposing aura of Ran Hongbin. Suddenly, the entire place went silent. They had anticipated all kinds of possibilities in this situation. They had also thought that Yi Shiwen might refuse. However, they had never expected that he would refuse so blatantly, and with such contempt at that. Ran Hongbin became furious. He could tell that the gazes in the surroundings contained an element of mockery for him at the moment. This young man before his eyes was as trivial as an ant. However, he had dared to tell him to fuck off in front of so many people. This was simply intolerable. Ran Hongbin shot a punch. It came with an incomparably overbearing palm shadow as it fell down towards Yi Shiwen from the sky. He had attacked with his entire strength, and hadn't held back even a bit. In fact, it seemed that his attack would smash Yi Shiwen to death. The drumming sound of thunder reverberated in the entire sky, and proliferated in all directions. This was Ran Hongbin's famous technique, the thunderclap tyrant fist. The fist's power was enormous and mighty. It seemed as if a thunder dragon which had been lurking in the clouds was roaring and coming down to kill Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen is done for. This thunderclap tyrant fist is a famous technique of a certain star field. I've heard about the incredible might of this fist technique. Ran Hongbin has obtained just an incomplete version of this technique. However, it still possesses enormous might since he has practiced it to the peak. It seems like the god of thunder himself has incarnated. What a pity. This boy had just appeared, and now he is about to die. The sacred spring of life will change hands this time. After that, it won't be that easy to snatch it from Ran Hongbin's hands. Almost everyone was optimistic about Ran Hongbin. Yi Shiwen looked like a debutante in front of Ran Hongbin who had long been famous. Yi Shiwen simply wasn't on the same level in their opinion. Moreover, Ran Hongbin hadn't underestimated Yi Shiwen. He had straightaway used the killing move of Thunderclap Tyrant Fist in order to crush Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen looked like a small boat on a mighty wave in the face of Ran Hongbin's stunning fist attack. He swayed up and down, and it seemed that he might get annihilated any time under this dreadful fist power. Audacious! A white-clothed young man was watching this fight from above a big tree at a faraway place. He slightly raised the corner of his mouth and drew a smirk. He then spat out these few words. However, it wasn't clear whether he had said it for Yi Shiwen or Ran Hongbin. Yi Shiwen would be able to identify this white-clothed young man if he were to see him. He was the same young man who had displayed the sky-shaking sword lights earlier. Yi Mo had guessed that his cultivation might already surpass the Sage Realm. In fact, Yi Mo believed that he had suppressed his cultivation to arrive here. Yi Shiwen slightly narrowed his eyes. The gazes that were hovering around didn't look very friendly. It seemed that these people were planning to snatch the sacred spring of life from his hands. And it appeared that they weren't ordinary. Ding Tong had advised Yi Shiwen not to compete for the inheritance seats of the Great Gas Building. After all, his arrival would certainly provoke many people that coveted the sacred spring of life. However, Shiwen hadn't paid attention to it. Everything was rather simple for him. He followed a simple rule: sort out the ones who are ambitious. Yi Shiwen finally moved into action at this time while facing the overwhelming fist attack. He shot a punch, and it drifted forward smoothly. In fact, it seemed as if a light feather was drifting amidst a collapsing mountain. However, this drifting light feather immediately shattered the momentum of that collapsing mountain and rendered it ineffective. It had looked slow. However, it was extremely quick. It had instantly defeated the fist power of the Thunderclap Tyrant Fist. Ran Hongbin had looked carefree until this moment. However, he was left stunned now. He was a peerless expert. It wasn't known how many enemies he had killed. He had reached this far by braving through countless bloody battles. Naturally, he possessed a rich fighting experience. However, he had been greatly startled when he saw that Yi Shiwen had effortlessly routed his fist power. This was clearly the power of the realm he dreamed of lifting lightweight as if its heavy realm. He had made the breakthrough into Sage Realm many years ago, and he had already mastered the lifting heavy weight as if its light technique. A mountain in his hands would appear as light as a large feather. However, he could never obtain this power of breaking the enormous momentum of a collapsing mountain with a feather as if it was nothing. He might be able to achieve the lifting light weight as if its heavy technique in the future. However, it would still be impossible for him to reach to the same level of brute strength as Yi Shiwen and pull off such a thing. His complexion suddenly changed as he realized this. He hadn't underestimated this man in front of him. He had attacked with his entire strength from the get-go. He had showed no mercy. So, it couldn't be said that he had underestimated Yi Shiwen. However, he had failed to figure out Yi Ziwen's fighting prowess in the beginning. Yi Ziwen's fighting prowess could in fact be placed in the Sage Accomplished realm as per his move just now. Impossible. How could you possibly master this realm? Ran Hongbin couldn't help but blurt out. He couldn't conceal the shock in his heart. He knew this realm entirely well. It had nothing to do with strength. It might be possible that even a great sage expert couldn't reach the edge of this realm. On the other hand, this insignificant man had grasped this realm completely. Many years had passed. Yi Shiwen was no longer in the initial stage where he had only half knowledge of this realm. Now he could freely enter and exit the lifting heavy weight as if its light realm and lifting light weight as if its heavy realm. And he could smoothly switch between these realms as well. Ran Hongbin's complexion had turned unsightly. He didn't feel as confident since he had seen Yi Shiwen attacking abilities now. He hadn't underestimated Yi Shiwen initially. Other people couldn't see, but he could feel how ferocious Yi Shiwen was. Bang! His body suddenly shook violently, and his entire real elemental energy began to surge. It seemed as if he had transformed into thunder. A crackling sound echoed from his body. He was inside an endless pool of thunder. It seemed as if a mighty god of thunder had incarnated. All kinds of ancient spells had emerged around him. A fist swept out and transformed into a giant thunder dragon. That shadow of a giant dragon mounted the clouds and roared. It then shrouded Yi Shiwen. It seemed that it would immediately devour him. He had unleashed his entire strength. He hadn't held back even a bit. A mantis trying to stop a chariot. Yi Shiwen sneered. A big hand suddenly stretched out. This hand was a blend of 3 palm techniques: Thousand Stars Tyrant Palm, Fire Clouds Falling Sky Hand, and Control Crane 7 Divine Hands. Yi Shiwen had nearly deduced these techniques to perfection. Yi Shiwen had blended a few big palm techniques in an instant. Only he could pull off something like this. In fact, it would be extraordinary if other people managed to practice even one of them to the pinnacle. Bang! Yi Ziwen's big golden hand and Ran Hongbin's thunder dragon suddenly collided in the sky. The terrible collision issued boundless shock waves. Ran Hongbin's eyes opened wide when he saw that Yi Ziwen's big golden hand had penetrated all the obstructions in a flash. Yi Shiwen grabbed the thunder dragon and clutched its neck. It seemed as if he was holding a viper in his hand. Bang! Yi Ziwen's golden hand exerted pressure and crushed that thunder dragon. It disintegrated into small pieces just like paper paste, and transformed into a mass of thunder and lightning. Ran Hongbin's offensive crumbled in an instant after that thunder dragon got strangled by Yi Shiwen. It must be known that the thunder dragon was the nucleus of his fist technique. It was also his strongest point. But Yi Shiwen possessed vicious insight. So he had understood that it was Ran Hongbin's most crucial aspect. An ordinary person couldn't do anything even if they figured out this weakness of their opponent. It was indeed the central part. However, it was also the strongest part. Therefore, they couldn't annihilate it even after knowing about it. However, Yi Shiwen was different. He had the power to crush it in an instant. Yi Shiwen had routed Ran Hongbin's offensive in an instant. He then arrived in front of Ran Hongbin amidst the sparks of electric light. Impossible! Ran Hongyin shouted. He couldn't believe that he had been outdone by a nobody of Sage Realm Peak. This had simply subverted his outlook of the world. However, Yi Shiwen didn't wish to explain it to him. He just wanted to make an example out of Ran Hongbin, in order to let the other covetous people know that they should drop the idea of fighting him if they cherished their lives. Bang! Yi Ziwen's incredible fist power pounded upon Ran Hongbin's body. Ran Hongbin screamed as he got transformed into a mass of blood fog. Both his body and soul had been destroyed. Chapter 571. There was a pin-drop silence on the scene. A vast area in the vicinity of the great gas building was completely silent. It seemed that even the sound of breathing could break this tranquility. The fight between Yi Shiwen and Ran Hongbin had attracted the gazes of countless people. It was a fight between a giant and an ant in their opinion. They had believed that defeating Yi Shiwen would be as easy as blowing off dust. In fact, they wouldn't have had any interest in watching this fight if it hadn't involved the sacred spring of life. However, Yi Shiwen, who should have been crushed to death, was in perfect condition after the fight. But Ran Hongbin, who was a colossus in their opinion, had been slaughtered. This outcome had simply subverted their whole outlook of the world, life, and their personal experiences. Driving full speed against the traffic wouldn't be as scary as this outcome. An expert of Sage Realm Peak had effortlessly killed a sage accomplished level expert. What would these people do if such dark horses were to move unhindered in this world? Yi Ziwen's eyes swept across everyone like an electric current. He had resorted to extreme methods because he wanted to warn these people. They must think properly if they were planning to snatch the sacred spring of life from his hands. Otherwise, they would have to pay the price with their own lives. This method was straightforward and violent. However, it was very effective. Yi Shiwen had killed Ran Hongbin at a lightning speed. He hadn't fooled around at all. And this had thoroughly deterred all those people who were ready to make a move. It should be mentioned that the majority of people had been coveting the sacred spring of life. Yi Ziwen's cultivation was only at the Sage Realm Peak. Therefore, they had felt as if a child had come to a market area with a piece of gold in his pocket. Consequently, that child had been surrounded by the bad gazes of all the adults. However, they soon found out that even several adults couldn't rival this child's skills. This had shocked the people who had been planning on seizing the sacred spring of life. In fact, those experts of Sage Great Perfection Realm and Sage Small Perfection Realm had immediately stopped thinking about this matter. After all, could they still dare to provoke this monster? Many people pondered. It's no wonder that this man has dared to arrive here with such confidence. He must have some big reliance. He might look weak at first glance. However, he is a merciless lord of death. Ding Tong and Xiao Yuan were also thinking so. They had seen Yi Shiwen killing sage accomplished level experts in the last few months. However, he hadn't killed them so easily in the beginning. He was very powerful at that time as well. However, he didn't possess such loftiness at that time. Now, it seemed as if a sage accomplished level expert was basically nothing before him. The powerful Ran Hongbin would have shaken the entire world with his might if he had been placed in the world outside. However, he had met with such a humiliating death at Yi Ziwen's hands. He couldn't withstand even 3 moves. He had been killed by Yi Shiwen in a flash. Everyone was left dumbstruck as they witnessed this insane strength. They had never seen such a formidable expert of Sage Realm Peak before. In fact, they were thinking that even the elders of their sects might not be a match for him. This man was way too strong. Ding Tong and Xiao Yuan belonged to different sections. However, they had the same opinion on this matter. He is that Yi Shiwen. A man was quietly standing in a corner in the shade of a mountain. His gaze penetrated through dozens of miles and fell upon Yi Ziwen's figure. The distance of dozens of miles was no big deal for experts with high cultivation. These were the people of the dominating Heaven Dojo. They were led by a middle-aged man who had robust facial features. He looked similar to King Tai. The middle-aged man looked at Yi Shiwen. His eyes were filled with bitter hatred because he was none other than King Tai's father King Yi. King Tai was his most beloved son. He had nurtured him to be the future lord of the clan. He could have become the leader of the dominating Heaven Dojo, or even the Great Gas City. He was the one who could have carried forward his legacy. However, he had died at Yi Ziwen's hands. King Yi had been devastated when he had heard this news. After that, only boundless hatred for Yi Shiwen was left in his heart. The rumors about Yi Shiwen had continued to become more and more intense in the last few months. And he was the one who had been pulling the strings behind the scenes and secretly spreading these rumors. Yi Shiwen, I must kill you. King Yi clenched his teeth in extreme anger and said, I'll use your head as sacrifice so that my son's soul rests in peace. Yi Shiwen had always been sensitive to gazes. However, the extreme hatred in this gaze had made him even more alert. Therefore, he had almost immediately noticed King Yi even though the latter had been hiding in a corner. Yi Shiwen, these people aren't looking at you with good intentions. It is obvious that they want to kill you. You must be careful. Yi Mo alerted Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen frowned. He took a step forward and crossed dozens of miles in one go. He had arrived in front of King Yi in an instant. He then swept his vision across all the people of the dominating Heaven Dojo. I didn't know that the people of dominating Heaven Dojo are still being haunted by the ghost of the past. He smirked. The people of dominating Heaven Dojo wouldn't be after me just because I had snatched the items from King Tai in the auction. I'm almost certain that these people have received the news about what had happened later on. Otherwise, they wouldn't be looking at me with so much hatred in their eyes. The killing intention flickered in Yi Ziwen's heart as he thought about this. These people of dominating Heaven Dojo weren't going to leave him alone. He had anticipated that he might have to face a great sage expert's attack after getting out of here. And his anger grew thicker after thinking this. Yi Shiwen, you've killed my son. I won't spare you. King Yi's anger soared as he said. He was staring at Yi Shiwen with his ice-cold vision, just like a wolf. He was wishing that he could dismember Yi Ziwen's body into 10,000 pieces. Your son has only himself to blame for his death. There is no reason to pity his death. Yi Ziwen's facial expression turned ice-cold as he replied. What did you say? King Yi pounced towards Yi Shiwen like a wild beast. The universe turned upside down in an instant. Seemingly inexhaustible deadly light swept out towards Yi Shiwen. It was a killer move. He had used such a move because of 2 reasons. First, he had bitter hatred for Yi Shiwen in his heart. Second, he had seen Yi Ziwen's formidable fighting prowess a moment ago. So he didn't wish to give Yi Shiwen any opportunity to counterattack. He must kill him quickly. However, Yi Shiwen was already prepared to face such an attack. Therefore, he was prepared since the beginning as to what he should do if this man suddenly attacked. Bang! Yi Zaiwen's big hand crushed all the deadly lights and offensives. Those deadly lights and offensives couldn't budge him. In fact, they couldn't even change his facial expression. Bang! 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 The sounds of explosion echoed in everyone's ears. An earth-shattering sound reverberated every time the two figures collided in the sky. The sounds of explosion shook the entire world, and energy proliferated everywhere. King Yi was the leader of the dominating Heaven Dojo. He was far stronger than King Tai. In fact, even Ran Hongbin might not be a match for him. Yi Shiwen attacked incisively. A big hand swept out, and the shadow of his palm covered the entire sky. King Yi had also gone all out on the other side. He launched an attack towards Yi Shiwen with his entire strength. The two were locked in the fight for a moment. Suddenly, the entire world turned quiet. The divine beams had dispersed in all directions. After all, Yi Shiwen had grabbed King Yi's neck with his hand. He had firmly clutched his neck, just like an iron hoop. Then, the killing intention surged up in Yi Shiwen's heart. After all, King Yi harbored a very heavy killing intention for him. So, how could Yi Shiwen leave behind a trouble for the future? Yi Shiwen tightened his grip. And, it became even more difficult for King Yi to breathe as a result. His face turned purple, and he started to appear even more sinister. His soul had also been imprisoned by Yi Shiwen. Consequently, he couldn't mobilize his real elemental energy. He looked like an ordinary person at this moment. He would die in a moment if Yi Shiwen increased the pressure on his neck. The sage experts were above the ordinary people. However, they still had this weakness. Stop! Suddenly, an arrogant voice came from afar. And a roughly 20 years old handsome man fell from the sky the next moment. He was dressed in a magnificent robe. His fair face carried traces of arrogance. He disdainfully looked at Yi Shiwen and said, "Stop! Who are you? Why do you want to interfere in this matter?" Yi Shiwen asked vigilantly. He wanted to exterminate these people from the dominating Heaven Dojo. There is a so-called saying, when the weeds are not eliminated along with the roots, they grow once again in the spring wind. Everyone understood this saying. These experts of dominating Heaven Dojo might scheme against him in the future if he ignored them now. And Yi Shiwen couldn't tolerate this thing. Therefore, he had taken the initiative against them. It is better to get rid of the dangers as early as possible. This was Yi Zaiwen's principle. Humph! I'm the guardian of this great gas building. You're in my territory now, that handsome and extraordinary man arrogantly replied. Guardian? Yi Shiwen recalled the information he had received in the past. People had a hunch that the great gas building might be some divine tool. However, nobody knew whether it was true or false. However, a person that used to claim himself as the great gas building's guardian would appear every time it opened. However, a different person would appear every time. Nobody knew about their background. Nobody even knew where they came from. These people were very mysterious. Moreover, each of them was extremely formidable. They were far more powerful than ordinary sage accomplished level experts. An expert of half-step great sage realm had once suppressed his cultivation and fought with one of these guardians. However, he had suffered a crushing defeat. Consequently, he had lost his motivation and the possibility of making progress in the future. These guardians were merely the experts of sage accomplished realm. However, they could often display fighting prowess that was far greater than that of an expert of sage accomplished realm. This was the dreadful aspect of these guardians. However, weren't these guardians only supposed to protect the great gas building? Why had one of them come out to interfere in someone else's business? These guardians also had some control over who would get the heritages of the great gas building. Therefore, one mustn't make these guardians their enemy when they meet them. In fact, one must try hard to be friends with these guardians, so that they could obtain their favor regarding the heritages of great gas building. That's right. And I want you to stop this now. That young guardian's face exposed arrogance as he said. After all, he believed that Yi Shiwen must follow his orders in an obedient manner. Don't you have any other thing to do? Why are you meddling in someone else's matter? Yi Shiwen looked at him maliciously and said, How dare you say that I'm meddling in other people's matters? Very well, I am expropriating your eligibility for the heritages. The young guardian's face looked sinister as he said. Chapter 572. Expropriate qualifications for the heritages. The faces of the experts in the surroundings revealed smiling expressions as they heard these words. They had also seen Yi Zaiwen's dreadful fighting prowess. He would prove to be a formidable opponent in the contest for the 10 seats. Therefore, their chances would increase greatly if Yi Shiwen was eliminated from the contest. Yi Zaiwen's complexion had turned ice-cold. "Hongjun, save me." King Yi had been clutched by Yi Zaiwen's big hand. So he promptly yelled since Yi Shiwen had nearly choked him to death. Yi Shiwen suddenly understood that both of them were familiar with each other. Nothing had happened when he killed Ran Hongbin a moment ago. However, this goddamn guardian had come out to interfere now when it was King Ye's turn. Guardian my ass. He's just biased towards his own people. Let him go. Hongjun coldly said. Get lost. Yi Shiwen coldly replied. Hongjun's complexion suddenly turned a deep shade of red because of anger. The guardians had always had an awe-inspiring existence. So, these experts must curry favor with Hongjun regardless of whether they had powerful strength or not. After all, it was impossible to obtain a heritage without his permission. Hongjun had never been disregarded like this. Just an ordinary expert of Sage Realm Peak dares to be this arrogant. It seems that you lack discipline. A person's contemptuous voice proliferated from inside the crowd. You dare to talk back to the guardian? It was obvious from the voice that this individual wanted to gain Hongjun's favor. Everyone had heard him. It turned out to be a demon beast. It was a huge Tyrannosaurus. It was a very famous demon king in the Great Gas Collar. Come forward and speak if you have the guts to do so. Yi Shiwen sneered while looking at that Tyrannosaurus. You want me to come forward? Here I come. The Tyrannosaurus suddenly trod forward, and its hill-sized body pounded in front of Yi Shiwen just like a meteor. The world shook under its impact. It alone caused an earthquake kind of impact and shocked everyone. The Tyrannosaurus was arrogantly looking at Yi Shiwen. It didn't move its eyes away from him even for a moment. Then, a claw suddenly stretched out towards Yi Shiwen to grab him. Its front claw was small compared to its body. However, it was still bigger than Yi Zaiwen's body. Yi Shiwen understood that this Tyrannosaurus wanted to kill him so that it could gain this so-called guardian's favor in order to obtain a seat. In fact, there were many people that were thinking the same. Yi Shiwen had killed Ran Hongbin only recently. Still, many people were willing to risk their lives for this opportunity. Yi Shiwen narrowed his eyes. It seems that I didn't deter everyone a while ago. Some people still want to rush out recklessly. A big golden hand suddenly stretched out. The fire cloud's falling sky hand suddenly issued a golden tide and slammed down. The palm and the sharp claw collided in the sky. The body of the Tyrannosaurus was extremely tough. It could break the mountains and cut open the world. Bang! The claw of the Tyrannosaurus turned into a mass of blood fog on the spot, and the fragments of its bones swirled in the air. Roar! The Tyrannosaurus screamed endlessly. It hadn't anticipated that its front claw would be destroyed by Yi Shiwen in the first collision itself. In fact, such strength left everyone to hold their breaths. And the experts and demon beasts that were getting restless were stunned by this. They had been thinking about obtaining the guardian's favor at Yi Zaiwen's expense, but they gave up that thought at this time. Audacious! You dare to commit a violent crime in front of me? Hongjun shouted. Then, his terrifying aura swept out towards Yi Shiwen like a tide, and dreadful energy waves ferociously swept down. However, Hongjun's interference couldn't change the Tyrannosaurus' fate. After all, Yi Zaiwen's rage had already been ignited. An inverting ocean seal formed in the sky, and fell down in an instant like a tilted ocean. Rumble! The Tyrannosaurus had been locked on to by Yi Zaiwen's attack. It wanted to escape. However, it wasn't able to do so. It got crushed into fragments in an instant. You want him, right? I'll return him to you. The blue veins in Yi Zaiwen's hands bulged out. Then he suddenly threw King Yi towards Hongjun, as if he was a piece of trash. Whoosh! King Yi screamed as he got thrown away. His body cut through Hongjun's terrifying aura and energy waves, and finally arrived in front of him. Hongjun coldly snorted. and unfolded his hands to catch King Yi. Bang! A loud metal clanging sound was heard, and a terrifyingly massive force transmitted to Hong Jun's hand through King Ye's body. Bang! 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 Hong Jun continuously trod on the ground and left profound footprints in it. Then he turned his head to look once the tremendous force had dissipated. However, he found out that King Yi was already dead. His soul had been shattered by Yi Shiwen. Hong Jun was shocked to death upon this realization. You want to die? Hong Jun opened his eyes wide in rage. Yi Shiwen had killed his friend in front of his eyes. He had killed a person that was close to him. This was a matter of great shame and humiliation for him. Consequently, his torch-like eyes swept out two sword lights towards Yi Shiwen. However, it was impossible for him to affect Yi Shiwen since Yi Ziwen's cultivation was extremely profound. Yi Shiwen, it seems that this shitty guardian hates you very much. It would be better to kill him as well, and be done with it. Otherwise, he'll certainly plot against you when the contest for the seats begins, Yemo said. Yi Shiwen nodded. He could also see the bitter resentment and infinite killing intention in Hong Jun's eyes. He might have to face trouble in the future if he didn't kill him as soon as possible. Hong Jun's murderous intent for Yi Shiwen had grown stronger. He wasn't planning to give Yi Shiwen any way out. Neither of them had attacked at this point. However, 10 thick and sturdy light beams suddenly emitted from top of the great gas building. They then flew out in all directions and formed 10 giant light pillars on the ground. Everyone suddenly went in uproar as this happened. The 10 seats of the great gas building had appeared, and the people would enter these light pillars would obtain the heritages. Hadn't they arrived here for these 10 seats? The conflict between Yi Shiwen and Hong Jun became worthless for them after the appearance of these 10 seats. Everyone flew towards the center of the great gas building in order to compete for these 10 seats. The area surrounding this huge great gas building had been divided into 10 regions. So everyone flew towards different areas to start the bitter struggle for the seat in their respective regions. There were only 10 seats in total. However, the number of people that had come to compete for these seats was 10 or even 100 times more. Bang, bang, bang. All kinds of remarkable martial arts techniques were unleashed in an instant. They formed dazzling and colorful rays of light in the sky, and covered it entirely. It wasn't clear how many experts had been turned into blood fog amidst those dazzling rays of light. This looked like the most tragic battlefield of the Azura. Everyone was rushing to snatch those 10 seats just like madmen. They were fighting for their destiny without any hesitation. Yi Shiwen also wanted to go and compete for the 10 seats. However, Hong Jun hadn't moved even a bit from his front. Hong Jun's eyes looked ice-cold as he held an iron spear in his hand. His body emitted an oppressive aura which swept across. Give up the thought of obtaining those seats as long as I'm here, Hong Jun coldly said. His words were brimming with bitter hatred for Yi Shiwen. He hated Yi Shiwen very much. Then he attacked with his entire strength, and his surging imposing aura made the surrounding space boil. Many people were left to tremble as a result. Consequently, they didn't dare to go close to Hong Jun. A lot of people had gone to compete for the 10 seats. However, there were many people who were aware of where they stood, and they knew that they didn't stand a chance. Therefore, they hadn't gone to join in on the action since they didn't wish to throw away their lives. Consequently, the unfinished fight between Yi Shiwen and Hong Jun had become their center of attention. A lot of people were terrified in their hearts, especially the experts of the River Shore Star Field. They hadn't forgotten about the legends of the Guardians. A different Guardian would appear every time the Great Gas Collar opened. However, each of these Guardians possessed incomparably formidable strength, and nobody knew about their origins or why they would appear. In fact, nobody knew whether the matter about the so-called Guardians of the Great Gas Building was real or fake. Some people guessed that they might originate from some formidable and mysterious organization, while others believed that the Great Gas Building itself was the base camp of this force. It was their stronghold. However, everyone had come to acknowledge the fact that these Guardians possessed very tyrannical strength, regardless of what was said in the legends or how many different opinions were present. An ordinary expert of sage accomplished realm was simply not a match for them. The Guardians didn't interfere in the disputes of other experts. They were like observers. However, this time's guardian had unexpectedly interfered in someone's matter. This was contrary to everyone's expectations. A lot of people felt sympathetic towards Yi Shiwen. After all, Yi Shiwen had previously had the opportunity to obtain a seat. However, it was gone now as he had unfortunately offended the guardian. It was impossible for a person to obtain a heritage if they offended a guardian. This had been the rule for last several years. It wasn't that nobody had used their tyrannical power to go against the rules set by the guardians in the past. However, all of them had failed to obtain a heritage in the end. Therefore, there were many people who wanted to obtain the favor of the guardian. The guardians had a track record of not interfering with the contest. However, everything would become much simpler if the guardians left a loophole. Yi Shiwen narrowed his eyes. His murderous aura looked boundless and ice-cold. He had realized that it would be impossible for him to go forward if he couldn't kill this guardian. Therefore, he didn't hold back any further. His golden divinities condensed into pillars of golden light, and then soared into the sky while passing through the clouds. They appeared everywhere in an overwhelming manner. Yi Ziwen's black hair was blowing in the wind. His eyes looked ice-cold and ruthless, and his entire body had turned golden. It seemed as if a golden god of war had reincarnated. Hong Jun's complexion turned ice-cold. It seemed that he had also found out that Yi Shiwen wasn't an ordinary person. It hadn't been a wise choice to offend Yi Shiwen. However, Hong Jun was clearly an arrogant person. Therefore, he still didn't feel that he had made a mistake by provoking Yi Shiwen. In fact, he still felt that Yi Shiwen was guilty of a terrible crime, and was truly the most reprehensible person out there. Criminal, accept your death. There was an unconcealed killing intention in Hong Jun's eyes. Criminal? Who the hell are you to judge me? Yi Shiwen wasn't angry. On the contrary, he grinned and exposed his white teeth. His words were filled with disdain and disregard. Who the hell are you? The many experts in the distance were shocked when they heard. Many years had passed since the time the guardians had established their prestige. Nobody had ever dared to talk to them like this. Chapter 573. Not many guardians had appeared so far. However, the majority of people in the Rivershore Star Field had heard about these so-called guardians. Even the people in the other nearby star fields were aware of this rumor. The people wouldn't have been so terrified if there had been only one guardian all along. However, the fact that a different guardian would appear every time had made these experts scared. Moreover, many people believed that there must be a huge organization behind them, and this meant that they mustn't be offended. "I'm the person that is going to take away your life," Hong Jun coldly replied. Meanwhile, his powerful aura swept out like a vast ocean. His expression turned callous, and he launched an attack towards Yi Shiwen. "You've challenged my prestige of being a guardian. Now, I will use your blood as sacrifice to redeem it." Hong Jun brandished his iron spear, and it issued a world-shaking sound. Its earth-shattering power was so overwhelming that it made the people feel as if it would break through the time and space barrier. These guardians are very ferocious. They are truly worthy of their reputation. They have been unrivaled since so many years. Nobody within the range of the Sage Realm can dare to provoke them, someone said in fear and apprehension. Apparently, such might had truly shaken this person. The space violently distorted wherever the iron spear went. The situation became intense. In fact, it seemed as if someone had poured oil on fire. However, Yi Shiwen rushed up unarmed. He trod upon the golden divinities, and got surrounded by a universe of his own. And all the attacks that were directed at his body were sucked by this universe. Hong Jun's iron spear broke the space. It wasn't known which ancient god his weapon had belonged to. However, Yi Shiwen was also an overbearing lord. And he didn't show weakness while facing this weapon. Bang, bang, bang. Both sides had already exchanged more than 100 blows within such a short time. And those were just probing attacks. However, both individuals had already gone all out. In fact, both of them had seemed determined to kill the opponent even though those were just probing attacks. The fight between these two individuals issued dreadful fluctuations. Those fluctuations then swept out in all directions from the point of their clash. and the experts that were observing in the front row went out flying upside down as a result. These experts had been several miles away. However, the shock waves had carried incredible force. The experts who had remained here to watch this fight had been swept away by the shock waves. There was a difference of heaven and earth between these weak experts and the ones that had gone to compete for the seats. Many of these experts spouted blood after being blasted away. Everyone was left in a state of disbelief upon the sight of Yi Shiwen. After all, he was fighting with Hong Jun unarmed. This had surpassed everyone's imagination. It wasn't that they believed that nobody could fight with Hong Jun. After all, the River Shore Starfield was very big. It obviously had to have some stunning geniuses. And a guardian would eventually lose his invincibility once a formidable opponent appeared. It wouldn't matter how powerful that guardian was in that case. There had been some cases in the past when the guardians had been defeated. There were obviously only a few of such cases. However, it was enough to prove that the guardians were mortals, not gods. However, what had stunned them incomparably was that Yi Shiwen was attacking Hong Jun unarmed. Even the term irrationally strong couldn't describe such body. It's no wonder that the Tyrannosaurus front claw had been transformed into a massive blood fog in just one slap. Such tough physique is terrifying. Someone suddenly reacted. Everyone knew that the individuals of the dragon race possessed incredibly tough bodies. The Tyrannosaurus was a kind of subdragon species that barely possessed the bloodline of dragon race. However, it was widely known that it had an incredibly tough body. However, the front claw of such a powerful subdragon had been transformed into a massive blood fog with just a palm's clash. This could scare a person to death. However, it seemed normal at the moment. After all, Yi Shiwen was fighting unarmed with an expert that had a sage tool. In fact, it wasn't known how powerful his physical constitution was. Everyone held their breath as they saw this scene. Such strength made them feel far inferior to Yi Shiwen. Hong Jun's face unexpectedly revealed a smile. You have innate divine power. However, I hadn't expected that your Buddhist strength would be far more powerful than that of an ordinary person. It seems that you've practiced some incredible body power technique. However, I'll plunder everything you have after I've killed you. Thereafter, my strength will skyrocket. Yi Shiwen was like a mobile treasure house in Hong Jun's opinion at this time. He was especially drooling over the body power technique that Yi Shiwen had practiced. It wasn't that he hadn't practiced a body power technique himself. In fact, he had practiced a very famous one. However, he couldn't rely on his physical strength to contend against the demon beasts who themselves used to rely on their bodies. This was his innate weakness since he was a human. And there was no way to change it. Many demon beasts seemed to possess human-like wisdom. However, they would often be fooled by the humans. These things were innate. Only a person who had practiced a top-tier body power technique could contend against demon beasts. However, Yi Shiwen's strength was on a whole another level. You've made me even more excited. Hong Jun's face exposed a sinister smile. The aura exuding out of his body had become even more tyrannical. However, everything ends here. I don't know what kind of secret technique you are using that you possess such fighting prowess. However, you can't surpass mine. Yi Shiwen was just an expert of Sage Realm peak. However, Hong Jun could see that Yi Shiwen was displaying the fighting prowess of Sage Accomplished Realm. So, it was clear that he was using some kind of secret technique. Otherwise, it was impossible to do so. He had seen some people with insane fighting prowess who could challenge those who were a level above them. However, he had never seen or heard of an expert of Sage Realm peak challenging an expert of Sage Accomplished Realm. So it was obvious that Yi Shiwen was using some kind of secret technique. Otherwise, it would have been impossible for him to do so. You're ignorant. Yi Shiwen smirked. It was as if the things that Hong Jun didn't know didn't exist. This was a clear example of ignorance. Hong Jun's complexion turned somewhat ashen. He looked at Yi Shiwen with a cold and callous look in his eyes. In fact, his eyes seemed cold enough to kill a person. You're trying to infuriate me. It won't end well for you. Nobody can come and save you today. Hong Jun launched another attack after saying this. His iron spear issued a terrifying chill and swept out. It formed countless divine beams in the sky and slammed down like a boundless mountain. It seemed that it would definitely kill Yi Shiwen on the spot. However, how could Yi Shiwen let him succeed? He faced upward and roared. Simultaneously, his energy burst out and spread everywhere as the Big Bang Stardust fist swept out. Every fist blow transformed into a big star in the void and smashed down from above. It seemed as if a galaxy had suddenly condensed in the sky. Countless huge stars had formed in the sky and were about to crash down. The huge stars and the divine beams collided in the sky. They issued boundless divine waves every time they collided. The dreadful fluctuations attracted the attentions of those top players who were involved in the intense contest for the seats at the moment. However, the competition over there had reached a superheated stage. Blood was flowing like river, and a mountain-sized pile of corpses had formed. Everyone's eyes had turned bloodshot. They weren't able to cope with so many experts. Those people glanced at these too, and then shifted their attentions towards their own opponents. Only a short period of time had passed. However, 3 out of 10 seats had already been taken. The person who had obtained the first seat was none other than that white-clothed young man whom Yi Shiwen had seen earlier. His clothes were as fair as snow. His expression was calm and composed at the moment. He had been slashing his long sword in all directions, and nobody had been able to escape from his range. He had killed all the competitors in his region. Many of them had even been experts of sage accomplished realm. However, all of them had died at his hands nonetheless. And they hadn't even been able to injure him. In fact, they hadn't been able to spill a drop of his blood. His tyrannical strength had terrified everyone. Some of the experts of other regions had been planning to change regions. However, they had quickly given up this thought. After all, nobody was in a mood to face such a demon. It was evident that no one had the guts to go against him. The second seat had fallen into the hands of a middle-aged man in blooded clothes. However, his clothes weren't just stained with blood like that of the white-clothed young man. In fact, it was as if his clothes had been soaked in blood. It seemed as if he had crawled out of a mountain of corpses and an ocean of blood. His facial expression looked ice-cold. He looked like a god of death from hell. He looked extremely ferocious and dreadful. He had killed most of the experts that had come in his way in order to compete for the seat. Moreover, those who hadn't died were in a miserable state at the moment. Yi Shiwen would have been left in shock if he had seen who had gotten the third seat. It was that giant ape. He had fled away from those 3 zombies. However, he had revealed dreadful might at this place. He had defeated all the competitors and had obtained the third seat. These heritages weren't restricted to humans alone. Other creatures could also obtain them. Any creature could obtain these heritages as long as they possessed spiritual wisdom. In fact, even a piece of stone could obtain them if it possessed intelligence. The experts who were struggling at this time didn't have free time to pay attention to Yi Shiwen's fight. And Yi Shiwen also didn't have the time to look how the contest for the seats was going on over there. His attention was entirely focused on Hong Jun's body. You seem to have some power to back up your confidence. It's no wonder that you've dared to challenge me. Hong Jun let out a cruel smile as he realized that he had the power to kill Yi Shiwen. However, this is as far as you can go. This is it for you. Hong Jun pointed his long spear towards the empty space after he said this. It issued layer upon layer of energy waves as his figure swept towards Yi Shiwen like a bolt of lightning. The surrounding atmosphere froze and broke into halves wherever the long spear went. Almost the entire space froze and collapsed. The boundless chill formed a massive and overwhelming network in midair in a split second, and swept towards Yi Shiwen to trap him. Is this all you've got? You think this is enough to kill me? Yi Shiwen sneered. He trod, and the surrounding atmosphere transformed into a piece of universe. This was his domain. Then a fist swept out. It transformed into a big star and rolled down. Bang! A sharp and clear sound of collision was heard as that huge network of cold energy shattered under the crushing force of Yi Shiwen's big star. However, this fight was far from over. A long spear streaked across the sky and stabbed out just as Yi Shiwen destroyed the network of ice. This was a killer move. This deadly stab had emerged from behind the magnificent network of ice. It could kill Yi Shiwen in a split second. Chapter 574. This was the most dreadful attack. An attack hidden behind another attack could be termed as a fatal blow. This was just like the hidden sting in a hornet's tail. It seemed that this strike could freeze and destroy the entire world. Yi Shiwen was floating unfazed in the wind. The scary wind blew against his clothes, and a fluttering sound echoed. It seemed that the spear would crucify Yi Shiwen. Die for me. Hong Jun's vision turned ice cold. He had calculated long ago that he would kill Yi Shiwen at lightning speed. His long spear and martial arts had come from a mysterious inheritance. Therefore, his attack carried enormous might. He had issued a peerless move in an instant. This looks bad. I didn't think that this guardian would have a hidden move. Perhaps Yi Shiwen might be in trouble this time. These guardians have extraordinary origins. They all possess incredible innate talent. They also possess stunning heritages. They are regarded as outstanding among the people of our star field. However, Yi Shiwen is amazing even if he loses this fight. He has killed a few Sage Accomplished level experts depending upon his strength of Sage Realm Peak. I don't know what kind of power technique he has practiced. However, it may be assumed that that technique is stunning. The spot where Yi Shiwen stood transformed into golden rays of light. Then, the long spear penetrated through that group of golden rays of light and split the vast sky. The spear strike had gone in vain, and Hong Jun was left to feel gloomy as a result. After all, he was assured that this attack had the power to kill Yi Shiwen. However, Yi Shiwen had somehow escaped it. Did he teleport? It's impossible. Nobody can teleport inside the Great Gas Collar. Hong Jun was left dumbstruck. He denied his suspicion. However, he hadn't thought much when an ice-cold shout came from behind him. Is that it? The so-called guardian is so mediocre? Yi Ziwen's figure suddenly appeared behind Hong Jun, and the golden light proliferated in the surroundings. A star was revolving in his hand at an incredible speed, and its speed was increasing with time. It grew in size, and became as big as a mountain in an instant. Then it slammed down. One couldn't teleport in this place. However, it was well known what kind of speed Yi Ziwen's devil wings could generate after being unfolded completely. There was no difference between teleportation and moving at such incredible speed. Hong Jun's complexion suddenly underwent a significant transformation as he promptly turned around. The long spear danced in his hand and issued boundless divine beams to face the attack. Bang! It was a dreadful collision. Endless spirit energies began to violently surge about, and a great number of dreadful divine beams swept all across. Hong Jun's body went out flying like a kite with a broken string. He was about to spout blood from his mouth. However, he forcibly swallowed it down. He had done so because his vitality would have been damaged if he had spouted his blood essence. Yi Shiwen had also been struck. He retreated a few steps. Then, he looked at Hong Jun. Yi Ziwen's eyes had turned even more cold. Hong Jun was very powerful, and his guardian's organization seemed to have deep background. However, Yi Shiwen wasn't going to back down. At this time, Yi Shiwen profoundly felt that his current cultivation realm wasn't good enough. His cultivation speed was incomparably quick. He had already reached to the Sage Realm Peak within a short span of a few decades. However, he had also come across increasingly powerful enemies along the way. He was confident that he would emerge as invincible in his realm if his cultivation speed increased even further. You've thoroughly angered me now. Hong Jun's eyes had turned gloomy and cold, and his complexion had turned a deep shade of red after he swallowed back his blood essence. It seemed that his entire body was seething at this moment. Moreover, the principles inside his body had begun to come out. Everyone's complexion had turned pale with fright at this time. One must know that the principles were the most central thing of a sage expert. Sage Realm was different from Legendary Realm, because there were more principles in Sage Realm, and a person would be more powerful if they possessed thicker principles. This was the fundamental difference. These principles represented the realization of the heavenly laws of an expert. They were the concentration of the entire world's Tao principles. These principles mustn't come out of the body that easily. This was because a person's understanding of heavenly laws would decline if these principles were destroyed. Moreover, A sage expert would fall down to the legendary realm if their entire principles were broken. They would then be only a bit more powerful than the legendary experts. Therefore, people rarely took the risk of taking out their principles. The principles were as important for a sage expert as the demon cores were for the demon beasts. He became extremely angry since his principles had been forced to come out of his body. He hated this very much. However, his strength had also increased enormously because of that. 9,999 Tao Principles. This is the pinnacle of Sage Realm. Someone secretly counted Hongjun's principles and said in amazement, "It seems that his principles are several times thicker than that of an ordinary sage expert. His strength is hard to imagine." Hongjun suddenly erupted with power. A dreadful aura rushed out of his body and soared to the sky. The spirit energies in the surroundings got trapped amidst this imposing aura and rioted. The long spear was dancing in Hongjun's hand. He suddenly trod forward and disappeared from everyone's line of sight. Then he appeared in front of Yi Shiwen the very next moment. His ice-cold long spear pointed to the tip of Yi Ziwen's nose. His strength had increased drastically after he had unleashed the principles from his body, and he had undergone a tremendous change as a result. The atmosphere was cracked open in a flash, and the entire world began to vibrate. It was shaking crazily. Yi Shiwen also moved in that instant. He transformed into a golden light and vanished into the air. Yi Shiwen certainly wouldn't have been able to face such an attack if he were to be the Yi Shiwen from several months ago. In fact, he might not have the qualifications to be compared with this opponent in that case. After all, there was a huge disparity between every single level of Sage Realm. However, the present Yi Shiwen was different. His strength had advanced by leaps and bounds after he had made the breakthrough into Sage Realm Peak. He had become far more powerful than before. His movement became extremely quick after he transformed into a golden light. He flew whistling through the sky while tearing through its fabric. In fact, it seemed as if he was shuttling in the sky. His speed wasn't less than that of Hongjun even though he hadn't undergone any explosive transformation. Bang! 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 The two sides collided in the sky like two huge storms. They collided more than 10 or 100 times in that split second. They swept across the horizon like heavenly storms. Bang! But it wasn't long when Hongjun's weakness was exposed. He couldn't maintain this peak condition of his body for a long time. In fact, it was impossible for him to keep his body in a stimulated state for long. However, he was completely dependent upon his stimulated strength at the moment. Unlike Yi Shiwen, many people believe that Yi Shiwen had also stimulated his Boda's potential in order to burst out such fighting prowess. Otherwise, it was simply a fairy tale that an expert of Sage Realm Peak could defeat an expert of Sage Accomplished Realm. However, Yi Shiwen hadn't done anything like that since he didn't need such stimulation. This meant that Yi Shiwen could continue to fight in this way for as long as he wanted. However, Hongjun couldn't. Moreover, he couldn't overpower Yi Shiwen within the short period of time provided by the physical stimulation. And his physical state obviously began to decline soon after. Yi Shiwen seized this opportunity, and his long legs struck Hongjun's body like a whip. Poof! Hongjun retreated again and again after being kicked. He couldn't help but spout a mouthful of blood. He wasn't able to hold it in this time. But Yi Shiwen had gone all out on the other hand. In fact, he hadn't held back even a bit. How is this possible? There can't be such a person. I have already revealed my entire potential. I can easily sweep away anyone unless he is an expert of half-step Great Sage Realm. How can there be such a person? Hongjun looked at Yi Shiwen in disbelief. It seemed that he couldn't believe what had happened. It wasn't that he was too weak or anything. Instead, Yi Shiwen was way too powerful. It would have been believable if he couldn't beat Yi Shiwen using his normal fighting prowess. However, he couldn't believe that a sage expert could turn out to be a match for him after he had completely unleashed his power. However, Yi Shiwen had done just that. Hongjun had failed to overpower Yi Shiwen during the short period of time in which he had revealed his entire strength. And now, he had shriveled up like a deflated ball. How come you talk so much nonsense? Yi Shiwen sneered. He again shot a punch. It seemed that the world had lost its color. His fist transformed into a big star and smashed down from the sky. Bang! Yi Zaiwen's speed was extremely quick. Hong Jun hadn't been able to surpass Yi Zaiwen's speed even after the transformation. Therefore, it was simply impossible for him to exceed Yi Zaiwen's speed now. He couldn't avoid Yi Zaiwen's attack. Consequently, Yi Zaiwen's fist pounded upon his body, and an explosive force entered into it. It seemed that his entire body was being torn apart because of the tremendous force, and it began to collapse as a result. Hong Jun's scream proliferated in the surroundings. His principles were being shattered one by Yi Zaiwen's fist. Hong Jun's strength declined level by level with every principle that was shattered. These principles were the product of his great realizations. However, they were being shattered into pieces by Yi Shiwen. This was the disadvantage of unleashing the principles from one's body. It could be said that his strength had increased enormously within a short time. However, it had become easier for a person to attack his principles. And the loss of each principle was an enormous disaster for him as they couldn't be replenished within 1 or 2 years. And now, Hong Jun's principles were being destroyed one after another as Yi Zaiwen's fist pressed down further. Hong Jun finally felt the pain of regret at this time. He had looked down on Yi Shiwen at first. He had thought that killing Yi Shiwen would be as easy as crushing an ant. It was no big deal at all. However, he hadn't anticipated that the thing that didn't look big in his opinion would cause his demise in the end. Nor had he expected that Yi Shiwen would show no mercy. Yi Shiwen had broken numerous Dao principles. So, Hong Jun had become a useless person, even if he was still alive. He had lost all of his value. How can it be possible? I can't accept this. Hong Jun yelled. He had come out of the organization only recently. He wanted to become famous in the world. He wanted to lay out his own inheritance. However, he hadn't anticipated that he would die in this way. Yi Shiwen didn't listen to his nonsense. Instead, his fist pressed down fully. Bang! Hong Jun's body couldn't endure such an immense force, and got crushed on the spot. Then, it disintegrated and transformed into a mass of blood fog. A gust of wind blew, and carried away the bloody air. Consequently, it merged with the bloody atmosphere that had been created by the countless corpses that were lying in the vicinity of the Great Gas Building. Chapter 575. How could this happen? Are my eyes deceiving me? Or has that guardian really been defeated by Yi Shiwen? There was a period of dead silence. After that, the experts that had stayed here to watch the fight suddenly went in uproar. After all, they hadn't anticipated that they would witness such a scene. No one could believe this scene before their eyes. Everyone felt like they were going insane. A few people had defeated a guardian of the same realm in the past. However, no one had managed to kill one until now. This was simply unprecedented. Yi Shiwen and Hong Jun had been fighting at a very fast speed. Therefore, these people hadn't been able to see clearly. They had only been able to see 2 peak figures fighting crazily in the sky. The 2 figures had exchanged 100 blows whenever they had collided, and this had made it very difficult for these people to track their movements. But the fight had ended by now, and everyone could clearly see that Hong Jun had died at Yi Zaiwen's hands. This scene was extremely shocking. It had shaken everyone to the core. Hong Jun almost hadn't had the power to fight back, and had perished quickly at Yi Zaiwen's hands. A lot of people had become terrified when they had realized this. After all, this guy was extremely fierce. Some people had wanted to curry the Guardian's favor. However, Yi Shiwen killed them once he was done with the Guardian. This was an event that could pierce the heaven. It was unprecedented. Yi Shiwen didn't delay after he killed Hong Jun. He immediately rushed towards the Great Gas Building. The vast area surrounding the Great Gas Building had been divided into 10 regions by those 10 light pillars. And 9 out of the 10 seats had already been occupied after a bloody battle. 9 extremely ferocious experts were sitting upright inside different light pillars at this time. Each of them was a domineering powerhouse. Each of them had the energy to swallow the mountains and rivers. Each of them looked like a ferocious lord that could dominate an entire region. Yi Zaiwen's eyes swept across the entire region. He was surprised to see 2 familiar faces here, the white-clothed young man and the Juyin ape. The 7 other people were also extremely powerful and ferocious. Each of them possessed a world-shaking and murderous aura. In fact, it wouldn't be an overstatement to say that their vigor could encompass the entire universe. Many experts were standing at a distant place. These were the ones who hadn't participated in the contest. However, they were staring at these 9 individuals with a complicated look in their eyes at this time. These 9 individuals were the representation of the most dreadful fighting prowess at this place, until the 10th individual appeared. They appeared aloof and detached from the worldly affairs. Their appearance hadn't scared the others. Instead, the spectators had started to admire these 9 people. The fighting prowess exhibited by each of these individuals was far greater than that of an ordinary expert of sage accomplished realm. In fact, they could explode an ordinary expert of sage accomplished realm with just one punch. It was simply nothing for them. Each of these senior experts was eminent and unapproachable. They had reached here after passing through numerous bloody battles. The other people could only watch these 9 individuals, but they didn't dare to budge them. Everyone's gaze was fixed on the 10th seat at this time. The fight to capture it had reached the superheated stage by this time. Many people had been fighting for that seat initially. However, only a few of them had remained by now. I want the 10th seat. Yi Zaiwen's figure penetrated the void and arrived in the region of the 10th seat in an instant. He had carried an incredibly imposing aura along with him, and his ice-cold vision was fixed on those remaining 4 individuals. All of them were exceptional experts of sage accomplished realm, and each of them possessed stunning imposing aura. They had been exhausted after fighting for such a long time. However, they had quickly restored their energy by taking advantage of the time when Yi Shiwen was speaking. These experts possessed profound martial power, so they only needed some respite to restore their exhausted energy. Who do you think you are that you've dared to come here to compete for the seat? A giant tiger demon beast fiercely said with an ominous glint in its eyes. I can see that you have exuberant vitality. So, it would be better if you obediently become my meal. Yi Zaiwen's exuberant vitality was surging about. He had hidden it deep inside. However, it could still attract these bloodthirsty ominous beasts. Are you sure you want to treat me as your prey? Yi Shiwen narrowed his eyes and replied with a wink. Do I want to consider you as a prey? What are you talking about? You're just an insignificant expert of Sage Realm Peak. And you still have such arrogance? Don't consider us 4 contenders to be as trashy as that Ran Hong Bin. The tiger demon beast opened its mouth and replied. Its voice echoed inside everyone's ears like the sound of a big bell. This works out just fine. I happen to need a robe made of tiger skin. Yi Shiwen sneered. He didn't show any hesitation as he shot a punch. He knew that many experts had arrived here to compete for that particular seat. So it was impossible to force them to give up with just a few words. In fact, the use of his fist was the only way to let them know who the boss around here was. Yi Shiwen attacked with his entire strength. The iron sword in his hand soared to the sky and issued an inexhaustible sword beam. It transformed into a massive sword dragon and burst forth. It lashed towards the tiger demon beast while sweeping everything in the way. Every pore in his body emitted sword energy. His understanding of sword intention had already reached to an unfathomable extent. He had brandished his sword like a sword god, and the sword intention wreaked havoc wherever it went. It was as if it ruled the fate of all living things. The cycle of life and death had manifested inside this sword attack along with the perpetual flow of time. The tiger demon beast roared in fury, and a vast land appeared behind it. It was the king of this boundless land. It ruled this piece of boundless world. It was the violent overlord of this world. This world expanded everywhere in an overwhelming manner. It then overturned upon Yi Shiwen with overwhelming momentum. However, Yi Zaiwen's boundless energy rushed over while sweeping everything in its path like a dragon, and counterattacked. Bang! Yi Zaiwen's sword dragon smoothly broke into that boundless world with irresistible force. It then wreaked havoc everywhere. Consequently, that world was destroyed in an instant. However, Yi Zaiwen's sword dragon sank into the ruins of that world and got strangled to death. Both sides emitted dazzling rays of light. In fact, it seemed as if the starry sky had exploded. Dreadful shock waves swept out, and the other 3 competitors evaded one after another. It was evident that they didn't wish to come in contact with those shock waves. The tiger demon beast was extremely tyrannical. It was a different kind of demon beast. In fact, it could be considered as the king among the demon beasts. So it wasn't surprising that it was extremely ferocious, and had dared to look down on Yi Shiwen. Ran Hongbin had been extremely tyrannical in other people's opinion. However, he was a mere piece of trash in this demon beast's opinion. It ought to have the most powerful strength among the 4 remaining contenders for the last seat. It wasn't necessary that the most powerful one would have the final laugh. After all, it was possible that other 3 contenders could join hands against it. However, it still had ample confidence. The experts who were standing at a distance were also geniuses of the Sage Realm. Otherwise, they wouldn't have dared to arrive at the Great Gas Building at such a time. However, they could only watch from a distance. After all, they didn't have enough qualifications to compete for the seat. Only one person could obtain the heritage in this contest of dozens of people. The cruelty of this competition was unimaginable. However, Yi Shiwen didn't stop for a second. He took advantage of the moment when he shattered the world of that tiger demon beast, and trod forward. His figure emitted a golden flash, and he arrived in front of that tiger demon beast. Then, the sword light swept out like a dragon. Ding! Yi Zaiwen's long sword opened a bloody seam on the body of the tiger demon beast, and made its blood splash out. However, this attack couldn't kill it. The tiger demon beast took the advantage of this situation, and moved away from Yi Zaiwen's reach. Both sides were left in shock. Yi Shiwen had been stunned since he hadn't anticipated that this tiger demon beast's body would be so tough. After all, Yi Shiwen had failed to cleave it into 2 halves. However, the tiger demon beast was indescribably shocked as well. After all, it had tempered its skin to a great extent. In fact, its skin could be compared to a sage tool. However, blood had splashed out from its body in just one sword attack. This had gone beyond its imagination. Just a trace of surprise had flashed in Yi Zaiwen's eyes. Then his figure moved like lightning, and he brandished the iron sword in the sky. The sword energy crisscrossed everywhere, and soared to the sky. It then rushed towards the tiger demon beast. The tiger demon beast suddenly let out a loud roar. And the boundless world that had been destroyed by Yi Shiwen reorganized. Then that grandiose world crashed down towards Yi Shiwen. This was the embodiment of the tiger demon beast's artistic conception. It could reorganize this world at any time as long as it wished to do so. This means that it didn't need to worry as long as its martial arts cultivation was intact. Swoosh! The long sword shattered the space, and cut open this boundless world. Then, Yi Shiwen took advantage of this moment, and stormed into that world. Clang! Yi Zaiwen's iron sword suddenly struck the body of the tiger demon beast. That tiger demon beast's figure was like a small mountain. However, its speed was far slower than that of Yi Shiwen. In fact, the speed at which it was moving was simply nothing in comparison to Yi Zaiwen's. The iron sword unleashed heaven-startling sword beams. These sword beams then penetrated into the tiger demon beast's wound. It must be said that these strikes were insanely accurate. They didn't miss the point even a bit. In fact, it seemed as if the attacks had been calculated by a computer. The sword strikes entered the wound one after another, and prevented it from healing. Hundreds or thousands of sword strikes had entered the wound within a moment. Roar! The tiger demon beast screamed in pain. It wanted to escape. However, would Yi Shiwen give it such an opportunity? He suddenly slashed his sword in the sky, and it turned into countless sword lights. Then, these sword lights joined to form an incredible sword beam in the void, and smashed down upon the body of the tiger demon beast. Poochie! The tiger demon beast was cleaved into 2 by the sword beam, and it died a tragic death on the spot. The sight of this outcome left everyone dumbstruck. It seemed that they couldn't believe this. After all, they had believed this tiger demon beast to be the most powerful contestant for the 10th seat. However, it had been killed by Yi Zaiwen's sword attack. This had subverted all of their anticipations. Everyone had been scared by this outcome. In fact, they were so scared that they didn't even dare to say anything. Many people had become aware of Yi Ziwen's monstrous strength upon witnessing his previous fight. However, it was known to all that the tiger demon beast was a top-tier powerhouse. Therefore, even the people who were most optimistic about Yi Shiwen hadn't thought that he would be able to kill the tiger demon beast so effortlessly. There was a pin-drop silence on the scene at the moment. I want this 10th seat. Do you three have any objections? Yi Shiwen stared at those three remaining contenders. Chapter 576. Yi Shiwen swept his knife-like sharp gaze across those three men. However, it seemed from the look on their faces that they weren't reluctant to give up. They had fought to make their way here. Moreover, all three of them were outstanding geniuses of their generation. So they weren't the kind that would be willing to give up like this. The 10th seat had remained unoccupied till now. And this was because none of them had been able to sweep it away so far, since there was only a small difference between their strengths. Yi Ziwen's slim figure looked exceptionally grand at this time. He had awed these outstanding heroes like a venerable overlord. He had killed 3 experts of Sage Accomplished Realm after his arrival. In fact, one among them was a guardian. This had made everyone even more terrified and apprehensive. However, these accomplishments had increased his charm even further. Those 3 men could see that Yi Shiwen was insanely powerful. Therefore, they had no choice but to withdraw, even though they weren't willing to do so. None of them was sure that they could defeat Yi Shiwen. They were rivals of the same level. So they might be able to defeat each other, but killing was out of the question. After all, which Sage Accomplished level expert didn't know a way or two to save their life? However, that tiger demon beast had been effortlessly killed by Yi Shiwen. And this had shaken them to their core. They had realized that they could also lose their lives if they continued to compete for the seat. Yi Shiwen watched those 3 men retreat. Then his figure swiftly reached beside the light pillar and slipped inside it. All 10 seats had been occupied now. Rings of gentle light emitted from the top of the great gas building and enveloped all the 10 seats as soon as Yi Shiwen entered the light pillar. Everyone looked at these 10 individuals with envy. They knew that each of these 10 individuals was going to obtain a heritage. But these people didn't know what kind of heritage each of these individuals would get. However, it had to be incredible no matter what it would be. Yi Shiwen felt as if a flower had blossomed before his eyes. Then he suddenly found himself arriving inside an incomparably mysterious dark void. Countless luminous spots were littered across the entire space. There were many luminous spots. Some of them were emitting dazzlingly bright rays of light, while some were emitting weak light. Some of them were twinkling brightly like the stars in a starry sky. On the other hand, some of them were dark like the dark stars in the universe. Their brightness was too feeble to be visible. Is this the space where the heritage is? Then, all these luminous spots must be the heritages, Yi Shiwen quickly realized. These luminous spots might be various martial arts techniques. They could also be heavenly treasures that don't appear on normal days. They could also be sage tools, or maybe even great sage tools. Yi Shiwen shot a glance across the entire void. It appeared like a huge galaxy. The luminous spots closer to the center were the brightest as well as the biggest. In fact, it seemed that some of them had been dazzling since eternity. The ones in the peripheral regions of the void appeared smaller. He saw and realized that it would be better if he moved closer to the inner regions of the void. He didn't hesitate any further and launched forward. He transformed into a streamer of light and flew towards the center. However, he was cautious as well. He was vigilant towards the other people who must have appeared here to receive their respective heritages. After all, they had also proven themselves after passing through many battles. And they also possessed incredible power. But he soon found out that he was alone in this big space. There was no one else. This cooled down his mind. However, he then realized that a tremendous force was pushing him outward and was preventing him from going deeper. In fact, he felt as if a gigantic force was engulfing him with every step that he took to forge ahead. He had managed to cover 2/3 of the void by now. However, he couldn't move even a step further towards the remaining 1/3. He was a bit stunned by this. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that his strength was at the pinnacle of the sage realm. However, he had barely managed to cover 2/3 of the distance. Could it possible that only great sage experts could obtain the heritages here? However, this couldn't be the case because the people with strength above the sage realm weren't allowed at this place. This meant that the great sage experts weren't allowed to come here. So this wasn't logical. Yi Shiwen. Yi Mo appeared beside Yi Shiwen with a scholar-like appearance. This scholar's face looked strange and demonic at the moment. It looked weird regardless of how one looked at it. This could be a big opportunity for you to break through to the great sage realm. It won't be an overstatement to say that this is a genuine treasure. Yi Mo glanced at the void before his eyes and said, Yi Shiwen, do you know the biggest difference between great sage realm and sage realm? Yes. Sage realm and great sage realm involve the process of a person's transformation. Sage realm involves the transformation of a person's body, and great sage realm involves transformation of their soul, thereby accomplishing the perfect transformation. Yi Shiwen naturally knew about these differences. One mustn't think that the difference between sage realm, great sage realm, and legendary realm wasn't very big. After all, there was a difference in the very essence of one's being between the three realms. That's right, it transforms the soul. That is 100 or 1,000 times more difficult than the transformation of body. This is why there are only a few great sage experts. It will be far more difficult for you to enter this realm than an ordinary person. After all, your soul is 100 times more congealed than that of an ordinary person. Therefore, it will be extremely difficult to transform it, Yi Mo explained. Yi Shiwen nodded. It would always be more difficult for him to make a breakthrough than an ordinary person, whether it was the body or the soul. However, this place could help him with his quest to level up. Therefore, it was impossible for him to give up on it. The coercive pressure here is the best way to sharpen your soul. I think you will complete the transformation of your soul if you manage to reach the central region. After that, making the breakthrough into half-step great sage realm would just be a matter of time. Everything became clear before Yi Ziwen's eyes as he heard this. He had been worrying over the difficulty of crossing the great sage realm's barrier. And the most crucial thing for that was completing the transformation of soul. Yi Mo's words seem very logical. I can use the coercion of this place to complete the transformation of my soul. And this is perhaps the real treasure of the Great Gas Building. Yi Shiwen didn't hesitate any further, and stepped forward. However, he suddenly felt as if his soul was being suppressed. He felt as if some heavy object was pressing against his chest. This coercion was invisible. However, it had caused an impact on the depths of his soul. This kind of coercion was similar to the pressure applied by a sage expert on a legendary expert. It wasn't affecting his body. Instead, it was directly exerting pressure on his soul. And this was even more dreadful. In fact, a formidable expert could make a weak expert lose the will and ability to fight solely depending upon this kind of suppressive force. However, it ultimately depends upon how strong the willpower is on both sides. Even a weak person can break the evils of the world with just a bellow if their willpower is strong enough. Ordinary souls simply wouldn't dare to get close to such a strong-willed person. For instance, this coercion wouldn't work on those awe-inspiring ancient scholars whose minds were like mirrors. After all, their minds wouldn't allow any external afflictions to affect them. Yi Shiwen didn't use his real elemental energy, because he knew that this coercion was only suppressing his soul. And this meant that he couldn't resist it using his real elemental energy. Yi Shiwen could feel the coercion directly impacting his soul. A single step seemed like a great distance, as if he had to reach the edge of the world. Each step was like a natural moat that he must cross. He didn't know how many times he had failed in taking this one step. Time passed gradually. An entire day had passed by the time he finally completed that step. However, this was only the first step of a big journey. He had moved just one step forward. However, he felt as if his soul had transformed a bit. There were too few great sage experts in the space as compared to that on macrocosms like the true martial world. This was because the transformation of soul required the supply of an enormous amount of external forces. So one needed to draw support from the worldly forces. However, there were very few worldly principles in the space as compared to that in macrocosms. And this was true for the powers of principles as well. Therefore, the number of great sage experts in the space was far less than that in macrocosms. Generally speaking, a person must choose some big world if they wanted to reach to the great sage realm. After all, the rate of success would be greatly improved if one did so. However, this coercion was tempering his soul instead of the usual power of worldly principles found in macrocosms. Every second and every minute felt like an eternity. However, he didn't slack even a bit. After all, Great Sage Realm would be within his grasp if he managed to pass this trial. This task became increasingly difficult as he went deeper, and his pace decreased constantly as a result. Moreover, his movement also became stiffer. This coercion wasn't causing any impact on his body. However, it was still affecting his movement since it was suppressing the depths of his soul. Huff, huff, huff. Yi Shiwen was unceasingly panting. He didn't know for how long he had been walking. It seemed like an eternity. Moreover, it was getting increasingly unbearable with every passing second. He would get drenched in sweat, and then that sweat would get evaporated. Then, his entire body would get covered with sweat once again. This process continued unceasingly. Persevere. I must persevere. Yi Shiwen was unceasingly shouting in his mind. But, even his voice was getting somewhat muffled. The unimaginable coercion was attacking Yi Ziwen's soul unceasingly. However, he didn't have any way to ponder over it as he had already fallen into a state of daze. The weakness of soul leads to the weakening of the control over one's body to a great degree. The exhaustion of his soul had left Yi Shiwen to feel much more tired than how he would have felt with an exhausted body. Yi Shiwen used to regain his fighting prowess with the help of his incredible willpower, whenever he got exhausted at a physical level. However, his exhaustion of his soul had made it difficult for him to obtain the willpower to fight back at this time. He was gradually approaching the center, step by step, and it seemed that he was reincarnating with every step that he took. The closer he reached, the sturdier his soul became. However, he also had to face increasingly strong coercion as he progressed. He could feel that his soul was almost ready to complete a kind of leap. Therefore, everything would go in vain if he gave up now. He must achieve the complete transformation. He was only lacking by a little bit. I won't fall here. Yi Shiwen shouted. Every step was exceptionally difficult for him. However, it was also a brilliant opportunity to temper himself. Bang! It wasn't known how much time had passed when Yi Shiwen finally took the last step. But a startling change occurred in his soul as a result. His real elemental energy began to boil rapidly like water, and the imposing aura condensed on his body made a breakthrough within a split second. This breakthrough was bound to happen. Yi Shiwen had previously believed that it would be very difficult to make the breakthrough into Sage Small Perfection realm. However, this breakthrough had happened by itself since his soul had been transformed over the course of this trial. Chapter 577. The Sage Small Perfection realm turned out to be a logical breakthrough in this way. It had indeed happened in a matter-of-fact manner. However, only Yi Shiwen knew how many hardships he had faced for this to happen. In fact, he had barely managed to survive through it. He hadn't reached to the center yet. However, he wasn't far. It had taken him almost 3 years in the Great Gas Building to complete this trial. Yes, that's right. Yi Shiwen had been in the Great Gas Building for 3 years. He himself didn't know how much time had passed. However, Yi Mo had been keeping track of the time. It had taken Yi Shiwen 3 years to cover this remaining 1/3 distance. This distance wasn't very long. However, a great change had occurred in Yi Ziwen's imposing aura. Therefore, he didn't regret it even though he had to invest 3 years' time here. His soul had been transformed little by little, just like the water slowly turns into ice below 0-degree temperature. It was a qualitative change. Completing the transformation of soul was the most important step towards entering the Great Sage Realm, and Yi Shiwen had achieved this step in advance. Therefore, the remaining process had become much simpler. A logical breakthrough into the Great Sage Realm would only be a matter of time. Moreover, his chances of entering the Great Sage Realm had increased enormously. He had completed the transformation of soul, and had solidified it. And his cultivation realm had also benefited from this by making advancement to the Sage Small Perfection realm. Moreover, his fighting prowess had made the breakthrough into half-step Great Sage realm. Initially, he had anticipated that his fighting prowess might not make the breakthrough into half-step Great Sage realm, even if he broke into the Sage Small Perfection realm. It was merely half-step Great Sage realm. However, it contained the two words Great Sage. Therefore, it was very different from the Sage realm. But his body had acquired some characteristics of Great Sage realm, following the transformation of his soul. Therefore, his fighting prowess had also made the breakthrough into the initial stage of half-step Great Sage realm. Bang! Another burst of aura soared into the sky. It had burst out from the heavenly source mirror that was inside Yi Zaiwen's body. The bloody aura had gotten mixed with Yi Zaiwen's aura, and rushed out. Then, it began to boil in the void. The blood slave had also made a breakthrough just now. It had been stuck at the Sage Accomplished realm for a long time. But it had finally made the breakthrough at this moment. Yi Shiwen had thought that the blood slave must continue to absorb the soul of the Star Colossus in order to make the breakthrough. However, the blood slave had also made a breakthrough since Yi Shiwen had made a breakthrough. The blood slave was closely connected to Yi Shiwen. In fact, it could be regarded as his avatar. The fact that its deity had completed the transformation of his soul had directly influenced the blood slave that was inside the heavenly source mirror. Consequently, the blood slave had also made the breakthrough into the initial stage of half-step Great Sage realm. However, this wasn't the most important thing. The most important thing was that the blood slave could now manipulate the corpse of the Star Colossus to display the dreadful power of the initial stage of the Great Sage realm. Moreover, his safety factor would increase significantly after having the support of the Star Colossus avatar. Yi Shiwen, have you decided whether you want to fully integrate the blood slave into the Star Colossus and craft an avatar? But you won't be able to summon the blood slave separately in the future if you do so, Yi Mo said. Yi Shiwen had discussed with Yi Mo that he would fully integrate the blood slave into the Star Colossus and craft an avatar once the blood slave had made the breakthrough into half-step Great Sage realm. The advantage of doing so was that the blood slave would be able to fully control the Star Colossus. In fact, it would be like the reincarnation of the beast. So, it would be an entirely different thing from when the blood slave would merely enter the body of the Star Colossus in order to manipulate it. Moreover, it was possible that the blood slave would display the strength of the initial stage of Great Sage realm after getting merged with the Star Colossus. Yes, Yi Shiwen nodded. The blood slave wouldn't appear alone after it had been fully integrated into the Star Colossus. Only the Star Colossus would appear. However, the Star Colossus would become more than just a shell avatar, like it used to be in the past. Its strength would also increase significantly. Yi Shiwen didn't hesitate any further since the matter had already been decided. He immediately began the sacrificial process. He was sitting cross-legged in the middle of the void. The Star Colossus corpse began to float inside the heavenly source mirror. Then, the blood slave emitted a burst of bloodlight and slowly started to integrate into the Star Colossus. Yi Shiwen was the creator of the blood slave, and the blood slave's mind was linked with his. Therefore, he was feeling as if he himself was getting integrated into the Star Colossus. Yi Shiwen could feel every inch of the meridians, every cell, and every bit of the muscles throbbing within the Star Colossus body. These were the vital essences of life. Initially, the blood slave had merely latched itself onto the Star Colossus body. Therefore, it could only roughly control the Star Colossus body. However, it had thoroughly integrated into it this time. So this was entirely different. This was the only way if he wanted to use the Star Colossus body as freely as he would use his own arm. He felt that he had gotten control over the entire body of the Star Colossus within a split second. He had obtained control over it within an instant. And this was an entirely different kind of feeling from having just its shell avatar. Suddenly, the Star Colossus opened its red eyes. It was exuding an ominous energy from its body. A wave of divine sense swept out of its body and cracked a section of the void inside the heavenly source mirror. Yi Shiwen had finally fused the blood slave into the Star Colossus. Very good. It can display the strength of the initial stage of Great Sage realm now. Yi Mo was very pleased to see the Star Colossus inside the heavenly source mirror. He just waved his hand, and that crack disappeared from the interiors of the heavenly source mirror. He was the god inside the heavenly source mirror. Even a great sage expert couldn't escape if he fell inside it. Back then, the soul of the star colossus had also fallen into his control like this. Xiaoyu was sitting cross-legged inside a bloody enchantment not far away. Her aura was fluctuating. She seemed to possess an overwhelming power. However, her appearance hadn't changed even a bit even though 5 or 6 years had passed. She hadn't turned into a young miss yet. She still looked an 8 or 9 years old child. Time hadn't left any trace on her body. However, Yi Shiwen wasn't surprised by this. Nothing had changed in all those years he had taken her along. Her appearance had stayed the same as it was on the day he had met her for the first time. So many years had passed. However, she still looked the same. Nothing had changed. However, this was true only for her appearance. She had advanced by leaps and bounds from before in terms of strength. She had already entered the truth realm. She had neither tempered herself hard, nor had she used huge amounts of resources to boost her cultivation. She had smoothly entered the truth realm just by meditative cultivation. Yi Shiwen envied this kind of talent. Xiaoyu was very sensible. She knew that Yi Shiwen had gone out for an expedition, so she didn't disturb him. Instead, she had merely continued to cultivate in seclusion. She had continued such a boring cultivation routine for so many years, because she thought that she could be of assistance to Yi Shiwen one day. Yi Shiwen ordered the blood slave to make the star colossus perform an action. A claw stretched out, and the entire horizon inside the heavenly source mirror broke down into fragments. It was an exceptionally terrifying scene. Yi Shiwen felt a kind of unforeseen power surging inside its body. It flowed out from the beast's inner core, and circulated throughout its body. This was the power of Great Sage Realm. There was a difference of heaven and earth between this power and the power of Sage Realm. Now, you don't need to be afraid even when that damned lord of the dominating heaven dojo appears in front of you. Yi Mo spoke up like the pot stirrer he was. The lord of the dominating heaven dojo must be waiting for you outside. So it would be better if we go now and get rid of him. Gee, let's make him the best stepping stone for your new Great Sage Realm strength. Yi Shiwen hadn't reached the Great Sage Realm himself yet. However, the fact that the Star Colossus possessed the fighting prowess of that realm meant that Yi Shiwen possessed it as well. Yi Shiwen heard this point clearly from inside the massive head of the Star Colossus. The Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo certainly wouldn't give up. He must be waiting outside to kill him. So he could only avoid the siege of the Dominating Heaven Dojo if he stayed hidden here for his entire life. However, this was impossible. He couldn't stay in the Great Gas Collar for his entire life. This was because it stayed open for only 4 years every time that it opened. And now, those 4 years were almost up. There was no way that the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo wasn't aware of this fact. Therefore, Yi Shiwen was assured that he must be waiting for him to come out. And he was like to have many experts of Dominating Heaven Dojo along with him. Yi Shiwen hadn't even said anything when the entire world began to shake around him. The black void in his surrounding began to disintegrate bit by bit. It then disintegrated, and fell apart into pieces just like glass. The heritages of the Great Gas Collar had concluded. Yi Shiwen instantly arrived inside the light pillar seat where it had all begun. Countless gazes surrounded him at this moment. The contest for the seats had already ended, and the 10 individuals had already appeared here. However, a great number of experts were still present here. They were eager to find out what kind of heritages these 10 experts had obtained. The heritages could be of various kinds and categories. It could be a secret martial arts book, some rarely seen heavenly treasure, or even some divine tool. Everything was possible. Nobody knew what these experts had obtained, and this had added to their curiosity. However, Yi Shiwen found out that he hadn't obtained any heritage apart from the heritage space of the Great Gas Building. He had utilized the majority of 3 years' time in passing through the area of that powerful coercion. The time was too short. So he simply hadn't gotten enough time to think about those heritages that he might have been able to obtain. However, he didn't regret his choice. This represented the so-called saying you get back on the roundabouts what you lose on the swings. He indeed hadn't obtained any heritage. However, he had completed the most crucial step for entering the Great Sage realm. Therefore, he didn't regret it. The so-called gains and losses depend on one's perspective. And he believed that he hadn't had any losses. So he obviously hadn't lost anything. Yi Shiwen had suppressed a portion of his martial power in order to bring down his fighting efficiency to sage accomplished level when that void had collapsed. He had done so because people with strength above sage realm weren't allowed inside the Great Gas Collar. They would be obliterated if they appeared. Ding Tong and Xiao Yuan were standing far away. They hadn't left this place either. They became overjoyed when they saw Yi Shiwen emerge. They also hadn't wasted time in these 3 years. Ding Tong had already entered the sage accomplished realm. She had changed significantly from before. On the other hand, Xiao Yuan hadn't made the breakthrough into sage accomplished realm. However, she wasn't far from it either. The relation between the two women had improved because of Yi Shiwen. They weren't in a state of mutual hostility like they used to be when Yi Shiwen had met them for the first time. The expression in their eyes became even more complicated when they looked at Yi Shiwen. They hadn't made small progress in the last 3 years. However, they still couldn't see through his cultivation. Yi Ziwen's aura had become even vaguer. It seemed deep and incomprehensible. Chapter 578. Their mood had turned exceptionally conflicted as they looked at Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen was like a supercar that raced at a lightning speed. They couldn't overtake him no matter how fast their speed was. Yi Shiwen had advanced by leaps and bounds every time he reappeared after disappearing for a certain period of time. It seemed as if he hadn't made progress this time since he had suppressed his cultivation. However, they found him even more dreadful and unfathomable than before. Everyone had made great progress in these 3 years of heritages. The 10 individuals that had obtained the heritages had advanced by leaps and bounds. It now seemed that their dazzling brilliance would shroud the entire universe. These people were the kings among the sage experts. They were the so-called sage kings. After all, each of them was strong enough to sweep away a large number of sage experts. Many sage experts began to fly out of the Great Gas Collar after these 10 individuals emerged. It was the time for the Great Gas Collar to be closed once again now that the heritages of the Great Gas Building had ended. The Great Gas Collar would be blockaded by the poisonous gas now, and people would have to wait until the next time it would open. The demon beasts that had been previously suppressed by the Great Gas Collar were also about to wreak havoc. So nobody wanted to stay here for another 100 years. And fight with these ominous demon beasts. Humph! The sound of a cold snort resounded just like thunder. And an incomparably tyrannical divine sense swept down from above. It swept past the crowd, and soon locked upon Yi Ziwen's body. Great Sage! Everyone's face turned pale with fright. All these sage experts held a very high position in their respective star fields. In fact, they could be considered as the kings of their regions. However, this was true only as long as they didn't come across a great sage expert. After all, not even a team of 100 sage accomplished level experts could defeat a great sage expert. This was the so-called difference between quality and quantity. Therefore, even the most arrogant and violent ones among these people tried to not provoke a great sage expert as much as possible. In fact, they usually wanted to stay as far away as possible from a great sage expert. Everyone knew about the gravity of a great sage encirclement. Everyone's complexion had turned deathly pale. After all, it wasn't that the great sage experts had never intercepted people outside in order to rob their treasures. It had happened only on a few occasions. However, this didn't mean that it could never happen. They found out that a tyrannical divine sense had swept past their bodies and had locked upon Yi Ziwen's body. Everyone understood that this senior great sage had arrived for Yi Shiwen. Therefore, they felt relieved. They also became curious as to how Yi Shiwen had managed to provoke a great sage expert to such an extent. After all, this great sage had personally arrived here at the edge of the Great Gas Collar to deal with Yi Shiwen. Someone who was familiar with the people of Dominating Heaven Dojo quickly revealed the grudges between Yi Shiwen and the Dominating Heaven Dojo to everyone. And everyone was stunned by this. After all, They hadn't anticipated that there was a mortal enmity between Yi Shiwen and the dominating Heaven Dojo. However, what had stunned them even more was the fact that Yi Shiwen had managed to escape from the hands of a great sage expert even after offending him. This was simply a miracle. This man is done for. He was running amok everywhere in his arrogance, and had ended up offending a great sage. He has no way out of this. What a pity. This man is so powerful. He must have obtained some big treasures, and he must be carrying a lot of them on his person. However, all his wealth will be robbed by the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo now. Yi Shiwen had realized that it was the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo, right when that divine sense had swept down upon him. The Lord of the Dominating Heaven Dojo had been waiting for him outside since the last few years. But this was just as Yi Shiwen had expected. Yi Shiwen, why would you provoke the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo? Xiao Yuan looked at Yi Shiwen in shock. You shouldn't have come out so early. You should have cultivated inside for another 100 years. He might not have kept watch here for that long even though he is hateful. What Xiao Yuan had just said was a defensive method. It was also the method that an ordinary sage expert would use when they encountered a great sage. After all, shouldn't one just hide if they couldn't defeat the adversary? I can hide for a while. However, can I hide for a lifetime? Yi Shiwen grinned. Hundreds of years would pass in hiding. And I'd just end up wasting my time. And would eventually die. This lord is dead set on pursing revenge. So, I will give him the fight he so desires. Yi Shiwen, you're the one for whom this old man has come. The voice of the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo resounded in the space. His voice had burst out like a thunderclap, and had proliferated in all directions. Everyone was staring at Yi Shiwen. But it seemed as if they were looking at a dead man since he was being targeted by a great sage expert. After all, they felt that he wouldn't be able to reverse this situation no matter how many tries he got. He couldn't avoid death no matter what. Whatever he might try would be futile. Some people were feeling pity for Yi Shiwen. They didn't know what heritage he had obtained. However, it would be in vain now. You better not think of escaping. This old man has been waiting for you since several years. I had laid out a trap. And I was waiting for you to walk right into it. You had ruthlessly killed my disciple for some enmity that you and he had. So don't think about escaping today. The Lord of the Dominating Heaven Dojo had almost roared this out. He considered everyone beneath him. He was used to being arrogant and despotic. Even death can't wipe away his crimes. Yi Shiwen coldly snorted. He didn't show any weakness as he replied. Yi Shiwen trod forward after he said this. He transformed into a golden light in an instant, and then soared forward in the space with the vigor of a dragon and the ferocity of a tiger. Everyone was staring at Yi Shiwen in a daze. They didn't know what they should say. They couldn't decide if Yi Shiwen was courageous or stupid. After all, he knew that this great sage expert must have laid out a trap outside. However, he had still dared to rush out. However, nobody had seen that Yi Shiwen had already transformed his figure inside the golden light. Yi Ziwen's eyes didn't look as profound as they generally used to at this moment. However, they had become deep red. Yi Shiwen had been replaced by the Star Colossus avatar in an instant. It was just that he had transformed the avatar into a human form. Now, it wasn't a difficult thing for him to access a portion of the Star Colossus' secret powers. He couldn't reveal the main body of the Star Colossus at this time, since it could have caused a big uproar. But he was kind of excited in his heart. A great sage expert. He had never fought a great sage expert. Perhaps he would have scared a lot of people to death if he had declared his desire to fight a great sage to everyone. Most people generally try to stay away from great sages. But Yi Shiwen was looking forward to fighting with one. How audacious. No wonder you have dared to kill my disciple. A sneering sound proliferated from above. Yi Shiwen raised his head to see. It was a middle-aged man. He was dressed in magnificent clothes, and had a beard across his entire face. This made him look like a dragon. He looked wanton and unrestrained. His face exposed a fierce look at this time. One doesn't need courage to kill a dog like him. Yi Shiwen sneered as he shook his head and said. He didn't appear afraid as he looked straight at the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo. In fact, It seemed as if he was looking at a dead person or something. Yi Shiwen. It seems that the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo has made a lot of effort to catch you. He has arranged lots of matrix formations in the vicinity. Yi Mo laughed grimly. His voice even carried traces of disdain. Yi Shiwen glanced around. A group of sage experts had arranged incredible barriers in the surrounding space in order to entrap him. They had indeed made a lot of effort. Most people couldn't think of escaping if they came across such a battle formation. Even a sage accomplished level expert couldn't imagine escaping from this. On top of that, a senior expert of initial stage of Great Sage Realm, like the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo, was standing guard here. However, the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo might not have anticipated that Yi Shiwen had no intention of escaping. On the contrary, Yi Shiwen wanted to fight with him. The complexion of the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo turned ashen when he heard Yi Zaiwen's reply. You little bastard. It seems that you haven't yet understood that you're facing a great sage expert. You are intensely proud of your strength. However, ants will forever remain ants in my opinion. It doesn't matter if they can move things that are several times heavier than their weight. I can trample you to death whenever I feel like. Even 100 sage accomplished level experts can't contend against a great sage expert. The Lord of the Dominating Heaven Dojo stretched out a big hand with full force after he said this. The big hand swept towards Yi Shiwen to grab him. It spread in all directions just like an inescapable net. It then grabbed and crushed the space. This place wasn't in the territory of the Great Gas Collar. So, there obviously weren't any limitations on this great sage here. He was waiting outside for Yi Shiwen, because of this reason alone. After all, he was afraid of the Great Gas Collar's rules. Yi Shiwen is screwed. The Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo is going to butcher him. It's such a pity. An outstanding genius is going to perish inside this tight encirclement. He has obtained a heritage only recently. However, he won't get enough time to make full use of it since he is going to die now. Many of the experts who had gone inside the Great Gas Collar had gathered here at this time. However, they hadn't dared to approach closer. Instead, they were just watching from afar. There were some who felt pity for Yi Shiwen. However, there were many who looked happy. The majority of people in the world are like this. They often find their happiness in someone else's suffering. Is that all you've got? Yi Shiwen laughed disdainfully. He then launched his figure and soared up. He unfolded his wings and soared high up just like a legendary giant bird. His golden figure tore through the space. He grabbed the big hand of the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo and ripped it apart with ease. There was no delay whatsoever. In fact, it had seemed as if he had torn a useless piece of paper. It was an extremely terrifying scene. How is this possible? The Lord of the Dominating Heaven Dojo had thought that he would crush Yi Zaiwen's martial arts with ease when had arrived. So he felt very surprised at this time. He couldn't believe that Yi Shiwen had shattered his attack. After all, he clearly remembered that this man had barely managed to escape from his attacks a few years ago. Moreover, this man had only been able to save his life because he had entered the Great Gas Collar. So, the Lord of the Dominating Heaven Dojo hadn't expected that Yi Shiwen would be able to break his attack within such a short time. However, it was rather obvious that this had also happened because he hadn't attacked with his full strength. After all, the saying 100 sage accomplished level experts aren't a match for a great sage expert wasn't bogus. He could catch and kill a group of ants like him even if he had just effortlessly stretched out his hand. The only thing that had made him a bit afraid during their previous encounter was Yi Zaiwen's extremely fast speed. After all, Yi Shiwen had managed to escape at that time. His incredible speed had saved him from being crushed by a great sage expert. The Lord of the Dominating Heaven Dojo had laid out an elaborate trap this time because of this very reason. He had thought it to be a foolproof arrangement. However, he hadn't expected that Yi Shiwen wouldn't choose to escape this time around. Instead, Yi Shiwen had opted for a head-on confrontation this time. Moreover, he had even destroyed this great sage's martial attack. This is great sage? It's nothing special. Yi Shiwen trod through the void. He was surrounded by a golden light which made him look like a golden god of war. And defeating that attack of the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo with ease had added a bit more grandeur to his divinities. Countless experts were watching from afar. They became scared in their hearts when they saw this scene. This is great sage? It's nothing special. Who would dare to say such words in this situation? Even the peerless Heaven's Pride experts who had the best chances of reaching the great sage realm wouldn't dare to say such words. Chapter 579. Well, you're very audacious. The Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo laughed in rage as he said. He might have misjudged Yi Shiwen initially, and hadn't been able to get to him as a result. However, the disparity between Great Sage Realm and Sage Realm was still the same as that between heaven and earth. Therefore, he was unfazed by this development. Die for me! The Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo shouted in anger. The power of a great sage expert mustn't be disregarded. The terrifying imposing aura poured down like torrents in front of Yi Shiwen. The entire void had been crushed and transformed into dust under the pressure of his imposing aura. Yi Shiwen felt the terrifying aura. It seemed as if it would destroy the heaven and extinguish the earth as it swept out. He secretly pondered. There is indeed a difference of heaven and earth between Great Sage Realm and Sage Realm. However, it didn't matter how dreadful the imposing aura of the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo was. It was just like a cold breeze brushing against one's face as far as Yi Shiwen was concerned. After all, it wasn't Yi Ziwen's main body that was facing the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo at this time. Instead, it was the Star Colossus avatar. The Star Colossus had already cultivated to an unfathomably profound extent during its lifetime. On top of that, it was an illustrious beast species in the universe. So it itself carried its own coercion. The might of the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo might be a big deterrent for other people. However, it was simply nothing for this Star Colossus. An extremely sharp sound of breaking of space was heard, and the figure of the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo tore through the space and arrived in front of Yi Shiwen in an instant. It must be mentioned that a great sage expert can faintly touch the edge of the space principle. He had faintly used a bit of space principle when he had moved just now. Therefore, his speed had been incredibly quick. It seemed that he had reached the end of the world in a single bound. He had instantly arrived in front of Yi Shiwen by manipulating the size of the surrounding space. His speed was faster than the eye could track. Yi Shiwen was startled by this. However, he reacted in an instant. The Lord of the Dominating Heaven Dojo had already shot his fist. His fist swept out towards Yi Shiwen like a ferocious evil beast, and opened its mouth wide like a sacrificial bowl. It seemed that it would crush the void with its sharp teeth. This was the embodiment of the fist intention of the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo. It carried outstanding tyrannical might. In fact, it wasn't inferior to the rebirth of an ominous beast. This extremely profound martial arts technique had been circulated from ancient times. The Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo had become famous after he had acquired it. He had reached all the way to Great Sage Realm after passing through various expeditions with the help of this technique. Then he had set up a sect and become its founder. He had established such a big base. This technique was known as Star-Studded Demon Fist. He didn't hold back even a bit while facing this boy who had disrespected him again and again. He must kill Yi Shiwen in one fell swoop and reduce him to dregs. Oh, so it's this power technique? Yi Mo's voice reverberated in Yi Ziwen's mind and left him dumbstruck. It needs to be mentioned that it wasn't known how many years ago Yi Mo had been alive. So he didn't know about the relatively new martial arts techniques which had been discovered after his demise. However, he had recognized this power technique. And this meant that this power technique was obviously extremely ancient. This is an extremely profound power technique of the demon race. I'd once seen a famous almighty demon using it. Its might is world-shaking. One fist can crush the world. The Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo has obtained just a part of this technique. However, he hasn't obtained its core. Otherwise, this tyrannical power technique could have reappeared in the human world in its full glory. Moreover, the humans can't practice the power technique of demon race that effectively. Yi Mo let out a sigh and said. Clearly he was disappointed. Yi Shiwen was left in shock when he heard this. However, his hands didn't stop even a bit. It didn't matter whether the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo had obtained the complete version of this power technique or not. He was still a great sage expert. Naturally, he possessed infinite power which was way above the sage realm. He could display unimaginable power. Moreover, he had obtained his outstanding fame depending just upon this damaged and incomplete power technique. So, Yi Shiwen naturally couldn't dare to act carelessly. Yi Ziwen's hands emitted golden rays of light. The golden light burst out in an instant and covered the surroundings. Then the golden divinities began to boil. However, an ominous beast suddenly arrived at this moment. It then opened its mouth like a sacrificial bowl. It seemed that it would swallow Yi Shiwen whole. Whoosh! A loud sound of something tearing was heard. Yi Ziwen's hands had entered inside the mouth of that ominous beast while flashing with golden lights. Then his hands had torn apart its mouth. Roar! The ominous beast had been torn into two halves and had transformed into a lifeless fist intention on the spot. It subsequently vanished without a trace. The face of the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo exposed a stunned look. After all, he hadn't expected that Yi Shiwen would shatter his attack by confronting and ripping apart his fist intention. It must be said that he had encountered such situation for the first time in many years. Some people may have managed to block his fist intention, but no one had been able to confront and withstand his fist intention in this manner. In fact, hardly any great sage experts had crushed his attack in this way. After all, his fist technique was way too overbearing. Nobody knew how to escape from its edge. However, Yi Shiwen didn't seem too concerned about it. Yi Shiwen had just adopted the method of breaking 10,000 laws with brute strength to firmly eliminate his opponent's attack. He had always used this method to crush weaker opponents. The Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo didn't know that this was the most appropriate fighting method against him for Yi Shiwen. After all, Yi Shiwen had already cultivated the tyrant body to the peak of 7th layer. So his body had become tough to an unfathomable extent. And this meant that even a great sage expert couldn't kill him with one smack. Moreover, the body of the Star Colossus avatar was even more dreadful. In fact, its powerful body had enabled the Blood Slave to use its own strength of the initial stage of half-step Great Sage Realm to contend against an expert of the initial stage of Great Sage Realm. It could be said that it was very difficult for even a great sage expert to injure it. So, it attacked freely without worrying about anything. After all, it didn't need to be afraid of some great sage expert. The eyes of the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo turned ice cold and he said, "I hadn't anticipated that you would grow so quickly. You had run away frantically like an ant under my attack the last time. You were nothing before me. However, you've dared to provoke my prestige now. And provoking the prestige of a great sage expert is a more serious crime than killing my disciple, King Tai. Is this so-called prestige of yours more important to you than your disciple's life?" Yi Shiwen let out a ridiculing smile from the corner of his mouth. The so-called overlords were always like that. Maybe the most important thing for an ordinary person was their own life. However, one's prestige was above everything in the opinion of these powerhouses. And people's lives were inferior to those of animals. It was widely known that the experts under Sage Realm were considered as ants. However, there was no difference between sage experts and ants in the opinion of a great sage expert. After all, even 100 sage accomplished level experts together couldn't be a match for a great sage expert. King Tai was this lord's disciple. However, he was nothing compared to his prestige in this lord's opinion. He had constantly been looking to hunt down Yi Shiwen for such a long time. But it was difficult to say whether it was to take revenge for his disciple, or because he thought that he had lost his face because someone had killed his disciple. The Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo was looking at Yi Shiwen with his icy cold vision. He looked arrogant and domineering. He certainly didn't say anything in reply. However, he didn't deny it either. A lot of experts who were present in the surroundings felt bitterly disappointed as they heard this. Especially a lot of sage experts. They generally considered the experts below Sage Realm as dogs and ants. So, they used to act all high and mighty in front of them. In fact, they were aloof and detached from the worldly affairs. However, they were like ants in front of this great sage expert. They felt indignant. However, they didn't dare to say anything. Ants? Do you consider yourself a god or something? Ha 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 ha. Yi Shiwen suddenly burst into laughter. He was very familiar with such attitude. After all, people would stop caring about the lives of ordinary people when they became far more powerful than them. And such people would gradually develop a god complex. Yi Shiwen, you're a newly born calf that isn't afraid of a tiger. I must say that you're a stunning talent. Even I can't stop myself from admiring you. However, everything ends here unfortunately. No talent can last in front of absolute strength. The Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo indifferently said. Then his entire dreadful aura suddenly began to surge. He retaliated in a flash like an exceptional ominous beast. He finally didn't hold back while facing Yi Shiwen, who had unceasingly surpassed his expectations. That was because he now considered Yi Shiwen as a thorny trouble that needed to be dealt with. He's so powerful. Is this the real might of a great sage? A lot of sage experts were standing far away. However, they shivered and screamed in the face of the deterrence of the imposing aura of this Lord of the Dominating Heaven Dojo. They also knew how ferocious a great sage expert was in general. However, many of them had merely heard about it. They had never seen a great sage expert attacking. Therefore, they used to think that a great sage expert's attack would be just a bit more powerful than theirs. In fact, some arrogant people believed that the great sage experts weren't far more powerful than them. However, they were shivering at this time since they had finally witnessed the incredible power of the Lord of the Dominating Heaven Dojo. In fact, it seemed as if they were watching a god. A few weaker sage experts couldn't help but bow down in awe. In fact, even the powerful sage experts could barely manage to stand in front of him without collapsing. Only a few senior experts didn't look affected. And that white-clothed young man was one of them. He wasn't terrified by looking at the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo. In fact, he was somewhat in anticipation of the fight. The Julian ape wasn't far from him. He had just escaped by taking advantage of the time when the great gas collar had opened. He also looked normal while facing the imposing aura of the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo, even though everyone had found it hard to resist it. After all, he possessed the bloodline of a godly beast. Therefore, he wasn't fazed by these kinds of imposing auras. However, this had nothing to do with its level. Instead, it was because he possessed an incredible and noble bloodline since his birth. Everyone's eyes revealed a trace of shock. However, they weren't just looking at the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo. They were also looking at Yi Shiwen. After all, they had been suppressed by the imposing aura of the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo, and had been awed by his super-strong might even though they were merely present in the vicinity. However, Yi Shiwen was facing such dreadful might head-on. How had he withstood such overwhelming coercion up close? On top of that, he appeared to have a rather unaffected appearance. The tyrannical deterrence of the great sage level couldn't cause any effect on the body of the star colossus. Bang! The Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo once again shot his fist. It crushed the void in a split second. The star-studded demon fist swept out and broke down layers of void. And the disintegrating void got smashed down towards Yi Shiwen along with the fist attack. The collapsing space was falling in Yi Shiwen's direction. An ordinary person would have been brutally killed by this collapsing space if they were to be in his place. Yi Shiwen's expression turned serious. This Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo was truly the most frightening enemy that he had come across since his debut. He was also the first great sage expert that he was facing head-on. And this expert could rip apart Yi Shiwen's main body with ease. Chapter 580. One mustn't dare to underestimate the attack of a great sage expert no matter how arrogant one is. Yi Shiwen wouldn't even have been qualified to challenge a great sage expert if he didn't have the support of the Star Colossus avatar. It seemed that this attack contained the supreme principles of the world. In fact, even various Tao principles were twining inside it. It was exceptionally dreadful. The great sage experts had transformed their soul. This made it much easier for them to comprehend the principles of the world as compared to the sage experts. Consequently, every move of theirs contained these principles. They could shake the world with just one punch or one kick. However, Yi Shiwen let this attack approach him. He wasn't worried. It was true that his understanding of Great Sage wasn't equal to that of the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo. However, he could defend against the Great Sage level attacks without being worried since he had his extremely tyrannical body to rely on. A thought popped up in everyone's mind at this moment. Could it be that this Yi Shiwen can go against the heaven's will and win? Ordinary people thought that a sage expert could never contend against a great sage expert. But these people were outstanding experts of sage realm. So it could be said that they were extremely bold disciples. Some of them also had the confidence of advancing to the great sage realm in the future. However, such a heretical thought had still emerged in their minds, even though they were trembling under the coercion of the great sage expert. Such a thought might not have aroused in their minds if Yi Shiwen were merely an ordinary sage expert. However, Yi Shiwen had time and time again displayed power that was far above that of the sage realm. This had made them think like this. Yi Shiwen didn't know what everyone was thinking. In fact, he wouldn't have cared even if he knew. Only a chilling and murderous aura for the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo was flickering in his eyes at this time. The two individuals kept fighting and going far into the space. A small star exploded on the spot at this moment. Then, the two arrived inside a large barrier that had been laid out at a distant place in space. And a huge battlefield was isolated out for them in this way. The Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo unleashed his incredible magical powers and peerless martial arts to an extreme degree in this instant. He was casually playing out all kinds of martial arts techniques and principles at his fingertips. After all, the strength of Great Sage Realm was no joke. Yi Shiwen was using simple punches and kicks at this time, unlike the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo. After all, he knew that his understanding of Great Sage Realm was far inferior to that of the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo. Yi Shiwen's strong point was his invincible body. Or, it could be said that it was his good fortune to have the support of the Star Colossus. After all, the Star Colossus had made him capable of contending against a great sage expert. Yi Shiwen was aware of the fact that he was at a disadvantage pertaining to his lower realm. Therefore, his tactic was to enhance his strong point and avoid his weakness. He naturally knew that the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo was using his realm to his advantage. The Lord was using his dreadful magical powers to suppress Yi Shiwen. So Yi Shiwen used his brute physical strength to break the 10,000 laws. The two were opposing each other with equal ferocity. Therefore, neither of them had fallen into a disadvantageous position up until now. The speed of both individuals was extremely quick. They exchanged several hundred blows in a flash, and then separated far away from each other in the space in an instant. A dreadful storm swept all across as a result. Yi Shiwen's body slightly trembled. His body issued a kind of rhythmic vibration. The fact was that the space inside his entire body had cracked, and this had issued vibrations through his body. Yi Shiwen had incredible strength and a tough body. However, he seemed to have no way to dispel the unusual rhythmic vibration caused by this impact from his body. On the other side, the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo was in a far better state. He had unloaded the impact force off his body in merely an instant. Yi Shiwen, I must say that you're truly somewhat powerful. You have lasted in front of me for such long time. It's no wonder that you've dared to provoke the prestige of a great sage expert. The Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo looked at Yi Shiwen with a bit of surprise in his eyes. His eyes then revealed an even more raw killing intention. However, you're not a great sage. So, don't think that you can run rampant depending upon some weird body power technique that you've practiced. I shall now make you understand what a great sage expert can do. The Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo suddenly moved into action after he said this. He shot his fist, and this attack nearly crushed the entire surrounding space in an instant. You're great sage, so what? Yi Shiwen grinned. The small universe inside his body immediately burst out incredible rays of light. It instantly stirred up just like the real universe, and an insanely mighty force began to surge inside of it. Yi Shiwen also used a fist technique to counterattack. It was the Big Bang Stardust Fist. It seemed as if the entire universe had transformed into his domain in a split second. Now he would destroy the world. and return it to the state of chaos once again. It seemed that Yi Zaiwen's Big Bang Stardust Fist had transformed into a cosmos of stars. It swept down in a manner that made it seem as if it was the will of the universe itself. It immediately unfolded the flaw inside the fist technique of the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo. This was an extremely dreadful kind of force. It stopped the fist technique of the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo before it could reach Yi Zaiwen's body. This was the first time that Yi Shiwen had used his Big Bang Stardust Fist in this fight. This is Big Bang Stardust Fist. You're a disciple of the true martial university. Yi Shiwen hadn't expected that the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo would be able to recognize the origin of Big Bang Stardust Fist in a glance. One must know that many of the true martial universities people couldn't recognize this fist technique. This was because nobody had been able to comprehend this fist technique for a great many years. Therefore, he simply couldn't have expected that the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo knew about it. I had heard about this fist technique when I visited the true martial world in the past. This fist technique is very powerful. However, it seems that you haven't displayed the true might of this fist technique in the manner that you've used it, the Lord of the Dominating Heaven Dojo said. He had recognized this fist technique almost immediately. He had also figured out Yi Zaiwen's identity. After all, it was impossible for an outsider to learn this technique if only a few people in the true martial university were ever allowed to touch it. Therefore, he was sure that Yi Shiwen was a disciple of the true martial university. Yi Shiwen was startled by this. After all, he hadn't expected that this lord would be able to recognize it. This was the first time that someone had recognized the origin of his martial arts technique. The sage experts that were present in the surroundings trembled in their hearts. No wonder this expert is so ferocious. He's a disciple of the true martial university. The disciples that come from the inheritances of the main university are very different. There were thousands of forces in this universe. However, only a few of them could be compared to those top forces in various macrocosms. The true martial university was a colossus that had once ruled the entire true martial world. Therefore, its reputation was extremely formidable. The starry space also had all kinds of inheritances, sects, and so on. However, there was no difference between these people and the random cultivators with no backgrounds of their world in the eyes of the disciples coming from those macrocosms. A force in the starry space that had a great sage expert to keep watch could be regarded as a very huge force. However, the great sage experts were fairly common in those big forces which ruled the macrocosms. They had realized that Yi Shiwen belonged to a force that had tens of thousands years old heritage. This was a disciple of a truly great force. And they themselves could only be regarded as some random cultivators with no background in comparison to him. They were simply nothing in comparison to Yi Shiwen. They were like a commoner in front of a noble. Is that so? Yi Shiwen sneered. Then his figure suddenly swept out. He took the initiative and launched an attack towards the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo. His entire body had transformed into a star. He looked even more ferocious than he had a moment ago. Yi Shiwen was glowing golden, and it seemed as if he was the only true god in the entire universe. He seemed to have the invincible might of a god. The Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo was left in shock as he saw Yi Shiwen approaching with boundless fist intention. He had said that Yi Shiwen hadn't perfected this technique. However, he himself knew only a little bit about it. And Yi Shiwen had now taken the initiative and attacked. This had already surpassed his expectation. Yi Zaiwen's fist intention appeared as overwhelming as the universe. All kinds of mysteries and essences of the universe were reflected in this fist technique. It could be possible that Yi Shiwen might not have displayed the true might of this technique because of his limited strength. However, it was simply impossible that he hadn't grasped the very essence of it. After all, he had the mysterious space. Moreover, he had burnt so many primary spirit dawn to decipher it. He had consumed astronomical amount of resources to master it. And he had fully perfected this fist technique as a result. Humph! The Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo coldly snorted. A tiny ant-like sage expert dares to stand against me. You're courting death. The Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo once again used his star-studded demon fist after he said this. It transformed into a sinister demon beast in an instant, and performed a long-range raid in the space. The entire universe crazily shook every time it pounced. Bang! Two stunning fist intentions clashed at the scene in an incomparably dreadful collision. This was like a match between the depths of the fist intentions of both individuals. It was a match between the comprehension degrees of their fist techniques. The two fist intentions swept across everywhere. They distorted and devoured each other. The entire battlefield trembled under the aftershocks of the collision. It swept out swirling circle after circle in the air, just like sea waves. Those experts of the dominating Heaven Dojo had laid out a barrier in order to stop Yi Shiwen from escaping. However, they spouted blood one after another under the impact of this shock. In fact, some weak experts had been blasted away by this shock. They had laid out the barrier with the intention of stopping Yi Shiwen from escaping. However, they hadn't thought that a collision of great sage level would take place. Their barrier shattered and dispersed under the impact of the great sage level power. Yi Shiwen could pull off something like this? The people of dominating Heaven Dojo looked at Yi Shiwen in a shock. The Lord has attacked with his entire strength. However, he still can't contain him. My God! How can there be such a dreadful person? What kind of heritage has he obtained in the great gas collar that he has become so ferocious? His strength has advanced by leaps and bounds from before. We must retreat. Forget about catching Yi Shiwen with our matrix barrier. We will get killed if it continues like this, the people of dominating Heaven Dojo said in panic. The recent collision had made them realize just how ridiculous their setup was in front of Yi Zaiwen's great sage-level fighting prowess. Oh my God! Is he some kind of a monster? He has turned out to be a match for our Lord. This is truly against Heaven's will. The entire world trembles under the might of our Lord. He had entered the great sage realm a long time ago. What is Yi Shiwen in comparison? He shouldn't be this terrifying even if he's a disciple of the true martial university. Many sage experts were watching this fight from afar. However, the faces of the majority of them looked excited, unlike the faces of the people of the dominating Heaven Dojo. Chapter 581. The people of dominating Heaven Dojo were aware of the peerless magical powers and the top-notch martial arts prowess of their lord. Therefore, they were left in extreme shock when they saw that Yi Shiwen had turned out to be a match for him. However, the bystanders didn't have the same opinion. They also agreed that a great sage expert wasn't the way they had expected them to be. In fact, they had initially felt that even they could contend against a great sage. However, they had no choice but to retreat hundreds of miles when they saw the dreadful destructive power produced by the fight between the two individuals. After all, it would have been disastrous for these people even if the aftershocks of this battle had hit them. Many people secretly swore when they saw Yi Zaiwen's golden figure. He'll also enter Great Sage Realm sooner or later. Then he'll overlook the world with a proud smile. He'll be above everyone. The fight between the two individuals issued layers upon layers of shock waves with them in the center. These shock waves soared everywhere. The collision between Yi Shiwen and the Lord of dominating Heaven Dojo produced brilliant sparks. It looked just like splendid fireworks in the sky. The speed of both individuals was extremely fast. It was so fast that even those powerful sage experts could only see two streamers of light colliding in the sky. The two looked evenly matched. Neither had gained the upper hand. It wasn't known how many years ago the Lord of dominating Heaven Dojo had entered the Great Sage Realm. It could be said that his cultivation realm was profound, and that he possessed immense martial power and dreadful magical powers. This was Yi Zaiwen's disadvantage. However, he used the advantage of having an invincible body to the maximum. He possessed just one advantage, and he exploited it to the utmost. And he fought with an old great sage expert like the Lord of dominating Heaven Dojo to a world-shaking extent by depending upon that advantage. This was the aspect that had stunned a lot of sage experts. They had already experienced how dreadful a great sage expert could be from the body of the Lord of dominating Heaven Dojo. However, they couldn't feel such strength of great sage realm from Yi Zaiwen's body. In other words, Yi Shiwen was just a sage expert. However, a sage expert was fighting with a great sage head-on. This thing had overthrown their imaginations. The sage realm and the great sage realm differed by just a thread. However, this difference was as massive as the separation between heaven and earth. These people couldn't even dare to think that escaping from the hands of a great sage expert would be incredibly easy. So, directly contending against one was out of question. The two sides separated from each other in midair, and stood far away in the space while facing each other. Everyone looked at them from afar. They were surprised to see that a wisp of blood dripped from the corner of the mouth of the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo. Countless people suddenly went in uproar. Yi Zaiwen's ability to fend off a great sage expert was already beyond everyone's expectation. So, all of them were extremely shocked when they saw that the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo was the first one to get injured. After all, the disparity between Great Sage Realm and Sage Realm was deeply imprinted in their minds. Therefore, they just couldn't believe this outcome. A look of panic flashed in the eyes of the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo. He hadn't expected that this fight would reach to such an extent, and that he would even sustain injuries. It was certainly a small injury. However, it was enough to make Yi Shiwen feel proud. The Lord became even more afraid of Yi Shiwen. Yi Zaiwen's body was way too scary. He had never seen such a body. He had attacked several times, and every time it seemed that an ordinary person was striking on iron and gold metals. His fist pressure was as heavy as a giant mountain. In fact, an ordinary expert of initial stage of half-step Great Sage Realm would have been crushed into minced meat by just a single fist blow. He didn't know what kind of body power technique Yi Shiwen had cultivated that his body had become so incredibly tough. Yi Shiwen, you must finish this quickly. Otherwise, your entire stock of primary spirit dawn will be consumed. Yi Mo's voice entered into Yi Zaiwen's ears. Yi Zaiwen's expression turned cold. His blood slave was using its strength of initial stage of half-step Great Sage Realm to control the body of the Star Colossus. And the blood slave was displaying the strength of initial stage of Great Sage Realm in this way. Therefore, Yi Shiwen had to burn countless primary spirit dawn and transform them into spirit energy in order to provide constant support to the blood slave. It was as if a child's soul was controlling the body of an adult. It wouldn't be possible to bring out the entire might if there was no coordination. Therefore, this process required the support of countless primary spirit dawn. In fact, over 100 million primary spirit dawn had been burnt within a short time. A great sage-level battle was enough to make him poor and frustrated. On top of that, he possessed less than 200 million primary spirit dawn at the moment since he had recently come out of a long period of cultivation. He certainly had many kinds of heavenly treasures. However, they couldn't be exchanged for primary spirit dawn at this time of emergency. Yi Shiwen immediately understood that he couldn't drag this any further. Otherwise, it certainly wouldn't be the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo who would lose. It would be him instead. And because of the shortage of primary spirit dawn at that. Moreover, he would have no other way apart from having his main body escape if that happened. Bang! He moved at this time. His figure suddenly rushed out. It looked slim. However, it seemed as if a giant mountain had rushed out as he charged towards the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo. His murderous aura had also increased significantly. The Big Bang Stardust fist suddenly swept out. It looked mighty and enormous like the endless stars that were twinkling therein. It smashed down every time, like a section of the universe in itself. This fist attack had already broken away from assuming just the form of a star as it used to in the past. It now embodied the deepest creative concept of the universe. This kind of fist technique was too terrifying. It looked a bit more tyrannical than a while ago, when Yi Shiwen had used it during the fight. And that was because Yi Shiwen had gone all out this time around. After all, he needed to end this quickly. The dreadful fist pressure pressed down upon the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo, and he felt the pain. The astral wind that had been set off blew against his skin. In fact, it felt like he was being sheared by a knife. It was extremely painful. The Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo used the star-studded demon fist to tackle this attack. However, he immediately went out flying since Yi Zaiwen's fist momentum blasted away the star-studded demon fist with ease. The Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo stopped in midair while retreating. But he was in a distressed state at this time. And he was looking at Yi Shiwen with extreme hatred in his eyes. However, it was also difficult for him to hide the look of panic in his eyes. The experts that were present in the surroundings were almost scared to death when they saw this scene. A sage expert had challenged a great sage expert. And that sage expert not only turned out to be evenly matched with the great sage expert, but he also seemed unfazed. In fact, he was even trying to exterminate the great sage expert. Yi Shiwen looked even more tyrannical now than he had a moment ago. It was evident that he had held back earlier. And everyone became terrified when they realized this. A sage expert was fighting with a great sage expert, and had still dared to hold back. They didn't know whether they should call him a bold man, or an arrogant person who didn't know of the profoundness of this world. It had become difficult for the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo to conceal the look of dread as well as hatred on his face. He cared very much about his prestige. However, he had lost his prestige after being forced into this disadvantageous position by Yi Shiwen again and again. Moreover, Yi Shiwen hadn't even been using his entire strength. He had held back at the most crucial time. In fact, he had held back at a time when this lord could easily kill him on the spot if he wanted to. And this realization made the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo feel great shame and humiliation. Yi Shiwen sneered. He then rushed forward. He didn't give the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo any time to rest. The world was reduced to nothingness as Yi Shiwen advanced forward. He unleashed astonishing fist attacks, and they bombarded everywhere, as if they were dazzling fireworks. They streaked across the space, and issued incredible divine beams. These brilliant rays of light dazzled in the space. The Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo didn't dare to risk his life, and promptly retreated. He had also noticed that Yi Shiwen had become more tyrannical than before. Yi Ziwen's tyrannical body turned out to be his hidden trump. Consequently, Yi Shiwen could attack without any hesitation. However, this lord couldn't do the same. 3 of his punches to Yi Ziwen's body might not be able to injure Yi Shiwen very seriously. However, 1 fist from Yi Shiwen could injure him badly. This was essentially the main disparity between them. And this was also the reason why he couldn't dare to face Yi Shiwen head-on. Bang! He had promptly retreated. However, Yi Ziwen's speed was even faster. So the impact of this fist attack still pounded upon his body. Half of his body almost got exploded, and turned into a mess. And his complexion suddenly turned deathly pale as a result. However, he promptly operated his martial power to restore his injuries. His vitality was exceptionally tenacious since he was a great sage expert. Therefore, he managed to heal his injuries within a short time. However, there was an indescribable grievance in his eyes at the moment. He was terrified and angry at the same time. He didn't pay attention to sage experts on usual days. In fact, he considered them like ants. However, he had suffered a setback at the hands of one at this juncture. He had suffered a huge defeat at the hands of a person whom he had underestimated initially, and had considered as an ant. This was a huge irony. Yi Shiwen, don't feel too proud. I can see that you are certainly using some kind of secret technique, because of which you have managed to pose a threat to a great sage expert like me. I will wait until this secret technique of yours gets exhausted. Then it will be a dead end for you. It would be better if both of us take a step back and start over once again. The eyes of the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo flickered as he said. He was planning in his heart. He could see that Yi Ziwen's current tyrannical condition was unbelievable. Therefore, it was obviously that Yi Shiwen was using some secret technique. However, it was impossible to carry such imposing aura for a long time. Therefore, he must drag this out for now. After all, this man would return to his ant-like sage-level condition with the passage of time. And he wouldn't have to beat around the bush at that time. Instead, he could kill Yi Shiwen with the utmost brutality, and extract revenge for the humiliation that he was facing at this time. Yi Shiwen sneered in reply. He saw through the plan of the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo and said, "It's a good plan. However, you won't be able to wait until then." Yi Shiwen once again rushed out to attack without caring about anything. Bang! The void under his feet cracked with a loud explosive sound. and he arrived in front of the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo almost instantly. Who would have imagined that the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo would have to escape in the end? That he would flee in such a determined manner? However, the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo turned around and escaped the moment he became certain that Yi Shiwen couldn't be fooled. Yi Shiwen, your death is imminent. You have dared to challenge the prestige of a great sage expert even though you are a sage expert. The Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo shouted in a flustered and exasperated manner while he escaped. How come I don't know that my death is imminent? Yi Shiwen smirked in response. The Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo escaped in the direction of the Great Gas City. This was his only way out since there were 3 equally powerful great sage experts inside the city. They were the founders of 3 other big forces of the city, and they could stop Yi Shiwen if they were willing to attack. In fact, it wouldn't matter how ferocious Yi Shiwen was in that case. After all, he couldn't contend against a group of 3 great sage experts. The Lord had planned on waiting until Yi Shiwen's most terrifying phase had ended, and he would counterattack thereafter. My 3 friends, quickly come out and help me in killing this evildoer. We will divide his treasures among us. The voice of the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo reverberated in the vast space. He thought to invite the strongmen to attack and kill Yi Shiwen together. However, he intended to sit idly himself and receive benefits, just like a fisherman. Humph! Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo, do you think we are fools like you? The sound of a cold snort came from inside the Great Gas City. This sentence had been spoken by a great sage expert. Nobody wanted to offend the powerhouse who was chasing the Lord of the Dominating Heaven Dojo, as if he were some stray dog. Moreover, they were basically rivals. And those 3 would certainly appreciate to have one less rival. You had it coming. The time has come to accept your death. Now die. Yi Shiwen's ice-cold voice came from the space, and immediately scared the hell out of the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo. Then, a huge star fell from above, and smashed down on the Lord's body. I don't want to die. The Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo screamed as he got transformed into blood fog with a bang. That you're tuning in to the Li Mei's Wuxia Whispers YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.